Hey friends, tonight, let's explore what happens when your feet can't stop moving, but not because you're enjoying the music. Imagine waking up in a tiny medieval village where the streets are damp, the bread is hard, and everyone's whispering about what happened yesterday in the square. People danced, but not in a fun way, not in a this song slaps kind of way. No, they danced until they collapsed, and then they danced some more. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And drop a comment with your time zone and what kind of shoes you'd wear to a 14th century rave. Dim those lights, fire up a fan for that cozy background sound, and let's settle in for the journey ahead. You step out of your creaky little house into the morning fog, still not entirely sure if what you saw last night was a dream or a minor spiritual emergency. The cobblestones are slick with dew, and there's a smattering of wooden bowls and sandals abandoned in the town square, left behind by people who dance themselves into unconsciousness or ecstasy. It's hard to tell in this century. The baker's boy whispers to you that the fever took Aunt Elise. And by took, he means she started hopping around like a grasshopper on a griddle and didn't stop until her knees gave out. She's fine mostly, just resting and twitching a little. You've heard of the legends. They call it choreomania, which sounds like the name of a disco band, but was in fact a very real phenomenon. In 1374, in Aachen, Germany, entire groups of people suddenly broke into dance. Not for fun, not for worship, but seemingly because they couldn't help themselves, like they were puppets, or cursed, or both. The chroniclers at the time, who were not exactly trained neurologists, were baffled. People convulsed. They screamed. They writhed and spun and tore at their clothes. Some believed it was divine punishment. Others whispered it was the devil's doing, or bad rye bread laced with ergot. You're not sure what's more terrifying, Satan taking over your limbs, or breakfast turning into LSD. Of course, the local clergy had a solution. As they always do, pray harder, and maybe stay indoors. And absolutely, under no circumstances should you dance, even if the spirit moves you, especially if the spirit moves you. You remember seeing Elise twist and clap her way across the fountain's edge, eyes wide, arms flailing, like she was conducting an invisible orchestra. She wasn't alone. 2 blacksmiths, a midwife, and a goat. Yes, a goat joined her. For a moment, it almost looked fun, until the midwife collapsed face first into a pie cart, and you clapped. Just once, on beat, a little too eagerly. And now people are looking at you funny. A man in a wool tunic walks by and mumbles, "Careful." It starts with clapping. You wonder, what if this isn't an illness, but a rebellion of the body? What if your feet are just tired of trudging through mud and hauling pails of water, and decide one day they'd rather boogie? Would that really be a curse or a revolution? Historians have argued over the cause of these dance epidemics. Was it a mass psychogenic illness? Collective stress induced hysteria? In a world full of plagues, famines, and questionable hygiene? Or maybe it was ritualistic, a leftover fragment of pagan festivals disguised in uncontrollable ecstasy. Perhaps it was both, and neither a medieval cocktail of suffering and suppressed joy. You pass the chapel. A sign is posted: no dancing, no humming, no suspicious toe tapping. They're serious. The priest has even chained the organ's pedals shut just in case someone gets ideas. You imagine what would happen if you showed up with a tambourine. Probably exile, or worse, interpretive mime therapy. But something's shifting. The village elders hold emergency meetings. Some say the dancers are heretics. Others believe they're prophets. A few wonder if it's all just very awkward exercise. You're told to keep your head down your hips still and your shoes tightly laced. That's the Middle Ages for you enthusiastic about sin, suspicious of joy. And here's the kicker. Some towns tried to cure dancers with music. That's right. They'd call musicians to play specific tunes to match the dancer's pace and ideally lull them into a peaceful stop, which sounds a lot like treating hiccups with a loud yell and a firm pat on the back. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it turned into a village-wide flash mob no one could explain. Now, imagine explaining this in court. I swear, my lords, I was just heading to the well, and the beat dropped. The question remains, were these dancers sick-possessed or simply fed up with feudalism? In a world where you could get arrested for laughing too loudly during Lent, a spontaneous dance party probably looked like witchcraft, or at least deeply suspicious cardio. And then there's you, standing awkwardly in the square, resisting the urge to move. A bird chirps, you twitch. A bell rings, you flinch. And when someone starts tapping a spoon on a barrel, you have to clutch your elbows just to stay grounded. The goat returns. It starts tapping its hooves. You back away slowly, because in this village, joy has consequences. Rhythm is rebellion. And dancing well, dancing might just get you excommunicated, or famous, or both. Which brings us to our first debate. Were the dancing plagues an example of collective madness? Or were they a deeply misunderstood expression of grief, stress, and suppressed emotion in a grim, joy-starved world? Anyway, you tiptoe home, very, very carefully. Oh, and one last thing. If someone ever tells you the Middle Ages were boring, just remind them people once moonwalked into unconsciousness. You wake up the next morning with sore shoulders, not from dancing, no, but from sleeping tense all night, just in case your feet got ideas. Outside the village is oddly quiet, suspiciously quiet. No clogs clacking, no humming from the dairymaids. Even the goat has stopped its syncopated hoof tapping. This is not normal. This is church-sponsored silence. It's festival day. Normally, the square would be a chaotic wonderland of pies music and people pretending they know how to juggle. But this year, things have changed. The banners are still up, but the fiddlers are gone. Replaced by a single scowling priest standing on a crate, arms crossed so tightly they could crush a walnut. You watch from behind a market stall as he points to a young couple who, in an act of pure unfiltered scandal, swayed slightly in time with each other while walking. Just walking, not dancing. But their feet may have for a moment aligned rhythmically, and that is apparently heresy adjacent. Hold your heart still, the priest warns. For the devil enters first through the ankle. You're trying not to laugh because it's funny, but also terrifying. The church in this century is not a fan of improvisation, especially not when it involves hips. If your body moves without explicit permission, you're on thin theological ice. This is the same church that believes in divine order. Everything has a place. Every movement should be measured. Every gesture deliberate. Joy. That's a dangerous loophole. Music. A slippery slope to the sinful swamp of sensuality. Dance practically a summoning circle with extra steps. And yet, there are exceptions. Saints have been known to dance in visions. Monks sometimes chant in rhythm. And some abbots even tolerated processional movement as long as it looked sufficiently solemn, like emotionally repressed gliding. But once someone adds a twirl or a cheeky clap, That's how you get sent to confession for 3 days and demoted from oat bread to barley. As you edge through the festival crowd, you spot Margot. She used to lead the maypole dances. Now she sells turnips and glances nervously at every drumbeat from passing carts. Last year, her maypole was the pride of the region. Ribbons, flowers, and children tripping over themselves in merry chaos. Then someone said it looked too much like a pagan fertility rite. The pole was burned. The ribbons were confiscated. Margot cried into a sack of potatoes for a week. Even the chickens seemed sadder. Now, her only rhythm is when she chops her root vegetables. And even that is slower than usual. You hear whispers among the crowd. The church is circulating the 7 movements of sin. It includes foot tapping, spontaneous spinning, and oddly shrugging in time with birdsong. You wonder what happened to them. Did a bishop once lose a dance-off to a magpie? You'd ask. But the last person who questioned doctrine ended up reciting psalms in a hayloft for 8 months. Out loud, 2 sheep. Still, people remember the joy of dancing. Quietly, privately. Some even rebel in secret. You've heard of underground gatherings where people dance behind hay bales, stomping only on soft moss to muffle the sound. They call it the silent reel. Others practice invisible dancing, which is just interpretive blinking with attitude. This isn't just fear, it's control. The church doesn't hate dancing because it's fun. They hate it because it brings people together. Unified rhythm, that's dangerously close to organized thought. And organized thought, that's one tambourine away from revolution. And yet here's a twist not all clergy agreed. In certain towns, local priests defended community dances as healthy outlets. They argued that joy could be divine too. That moving in celebration was an act of gratitude, not rebellion. And that maybe, just maybe, people deserved moments of ecstasy between plagues. Of course, those priests were quietly reassigned to contemplative duties in monasteries with suspiciously echoey basements. Still, the debate lingers. Even among scholars today, were these restrictions truly about sin, or were they about preserving power? When people dance together, they become less predictable, less afraid, less alone. You reach the edge of the square where a few children are playing hopscotch. For now, it's allowed. No music, just clapping stones, but a shadow falls over them. It's the priest again. He narrows his eyes at the rhythm in their steps. Be still, he says, voice low, lest the devil turn your skipping into sin. One child freezes mid-hop foot, suspended in the air like a criminal caught red-handed. You exhale slowly. It's going to be a long festival. You take your turn buying turnips from Margot. She gives you an extra one, slides it across the table like it's contraband, and whispers, "For dancing stew." You smile. She winks. Maybe the revolution starts with root vegetables. Tonight, the villagers will eat quietly. And tomorrow, maybe they'll gather in the field beyond the mill, where no priest watches, where the grass grows tall, where feet remember how to move. One historian once posed a question that still lingers. Was medieval society afraid of dancing because it led to chaos or because it led to freedom? Either way, your feet are tingling. Oh, and if anyone asks, no, you did not see Father Henri tap his foot earlier during the sermon. That was probably just holy muscle memory. The next day, you decide to walk to the neighboring village, not for trade, not for pilgrimage, but because you heard a rumor, whispers of a dancer. A real one. Still living, still twirling, still not arrested. It's a 3-hour journey on muddy paths and one extremely judgmental goose. But you arrive just in time to witness something questionable. In the center of a clearing, a girl spins, alone, hair flying like she's chasing a storm. She dances barefoot, eyes closed, as if no one told her joy was illegal. People stand around watching, frozen in equal parts horror and envy. No one stops her. No one joins her. But everyone knows this is forbidden. She's not just moving, she's glowing. And not metaphorically. Someone whispers that she might be a witch. You shuffle closer, pretending to inspect a nearby bush. This reaction isn't new. In fact, it's practically tradition. In medieval Europe, dancing too well or too freely often got you labeled something other than fun at parties, more like consorter with demons, or likely to hex a chicken. In some regions, especially during times of plague famine or heightened moral panic, the line between dancer and witch was paper thin, particularly for women, especially young women, and double, especially if they didn't have a husband or lived near suspicious herbs. You remember the story of Agnes from the mountain village. She danced in the forest every solstice, said it made her feel close to the stars. The bishop called it ritualistic immodesty. She called it cardio. She disappeared one autumn. People say she moved to the coast. Others say she turned into a fox. You're still hoping for the coastal option. The connection between dance and witchcraft isn't random. In many places, dancing was associated with pagan festivals, the kind with bonfires, flower crowns, and far too much eye contact. Church authorities worked hard to suppress these celebrations, and dance became collateral damage in the war against ungodly gatherings. But even more dangerous than the festivals was the rhythm itself. It spread. It skipped from foot to foot. It made people feel connected. And if you're a regime that runs on fear and silence, nothing is more threatening than unity set to tempo. There's a scroll you once saw in the scribe's office. It listed signs of possible witchcraft. Somewhere between, owns more than one cat, and laughs without permission, was moves without clear purpose. That's right. If your dance wasn't tied to labor ritual or suffering, it was suspicious. Dancing for fun, outrageous, unholy, possibly French. The dancing girl stops. Her eyes flutter open. She sees you. Want to try? She asks, holding out a hand. This is the moment where history either remembers you as bold or extremely flammable. You look around. No priests, no magistrates, just peasants pretending they're not watching. You take her hand. It's cautious at first, like stepping onto thin ice. One foot, then the other. A slow sway. Your knees creak like ancient floorboards. But then something happens. Your heartbeat finds the rhythm. Your shoulders loosen. You smile. You're not performing. You're remembering. The girl laughs, not mockingly, but freely. The kind of laugh that hasn't been heard since before people started whispering the devil every time someone did a spin. A child joins in, then another. Soon it's 6 people, then 10, moving in a loose circle, kicking up dust. No instruments, just clapping. The world doesn't end. The sky doesn't crack open. No goat explodes. You hear someone say, "We'll be in trouble for this." Another answers, "It's worth it." Then, of course, the warning bell rings. You freeze mid-step. Everyone scatters like pigeons at a feast. The girl vanishes into the trees, a ghost with excellent posture. You're left with a twig in your hair and no alibi. As you dust yourself off, a man in a wool vest mutters, "I saw her levitate." She did not. But no one's interested in details. This is how it starts again. Soon there will be meetings, inquiries, maybe even trials. The association between dancing and witchcraft has just been reignited, and this time you were there. Historians still debate, was this fear, a moral panic, or a calculated suppression of feminine expression and collective joy? Why did so many women, especially unmarried outspoken ones, become the targets of these suspicions when they danced? Maybe because dance is visibility, movement is power, and in a world where standing still is saintly moving freely makes you dangerous. Anyway, if anyone asks, you were foraging for mushrooms. Extremely rhythmic mushrooms. You make it back to your village just as the sun dips below the thatched rooftops, casting long shadows across the square. The festival banners still hang limp and slightly moldy now, like the hopes of anyone who thought dancing might return this season. You try to slip home unnoticed, but then you hear it, the distinct sound of boots stomping, deliberately, not angrily, not rhythmically, just intentionally. That's worse. Two local guards whose job descriptions mostly involve standing still and looking suspicious of joy step in front of you. One squints. "You were seen," he says. You don't bother asking what you were seen doing. They don't mean picking mushrooms. You dance, the other one confirms, as if accusing you of holding hands with Satan behind the alehouse. "I stepped," you clarify, hoping semantics will save your soul. They escort you to the village hall, a stone room with drafty windows and the lingering scent of dried leeks. A magistrate waits inside Quill, ready brows, already disappointed. The interrogation begins. Were you at the meadow? Did you spin counterclockwise? Were the movements synchronized or chaotic? You try to answer politely, but every response sounds like a confession from someone who accidentally invented jazz. Eventually, they let you go. With a warning. One more infraction, and you'll be brought before the council. The council, where dancing offenses are listed next to offenses like grain theft, blasphemy, and sheep impersonation. Don't ask. This might sound extreme, but it's surprisingly common in certain corners of the Middle Ages. Some municipalities, especially in Germany and Switzerland, had explicit laws regulating public dancing. You needed a permit to move rhythmically in some towns. Not a metaphorical permit, a literal wax-stamped pay-a-fee kind of permit. And even if you did get one, there were rules. No dancing during Lent, no dancing near churches, and certainly no dancing after dusk, unless someone was getting married or dying. Preferably the second, because morning dances were ironically more acceptable than celebration. In fact, during the 14th and 15th centuries, many cities adopted ordinances banning spontaneous or unsupervised dance events. Why? Because dancing led to crowds, and crowds led to laughter, and laughter led to wine, and wine led to, well, shirts coming off. That's the logic anyway. You sit on your doorstep, staring out at the quiet village. Somewhere, a couple of teenagers are bouncing slightly to a rhythm only they can hear. Rebellion takes many forms. Sometimes it's a revolution. Sometimes it's a shoulder shimmy. Your neighbor, old Helene, shuffles by. She has no time for joy, but all the time for surveillance. Careful, child. She rasps, even wiggling toes can bring the inquisitors. You nod respectfully and wiggle nothing. Still, there's a part of you that can't let it go. Not the dance itself, but the question. Why did it scare them so much? A scholar once suggested that dancing was dangerous because it blurred boundaries. between men and women, sacred and secular order and chaos. In a society built on tight hierarchies and precise rituals, dance was too loose, too open, too human. Another theory argues that communal dance was often tied to festivals and rituals that predated Christianity celebrations of fertility, harvest, and renewal. Suppressing the dance was a way to erase the past and tighten control over the present. But there's something else too. Dancing is unpredictable. It resists translation into rules. You can't tax a pirouette. You can't tie the jig. And if everyone's dancing together, they might just stop listening to the sermon. You remember a traveling jester once said, "If you want to avoid taxes, make it art. If you want to avoid arrest, make it boring." He was arrested shortly after for juggling too expressively. That night you hear drums in your dreams, not angry drums, joyful ones, wooden and warm and full of possibility. You wake up half smiling and immediately stop because Helene is outside again, peering through her curtain like it owes her rent. You stand, stretch, and take 2 steps in your own kitchen. Just steps, not dance. Definitely not in rhythm. You are a law-abiding villager with suspiciously graceful ankles. And if someone catches you, you're prepared to say, "I tripped," artistically. Today is a wedding day, which in your village is only slightly more festive than a tax audit. The bride is pale, the groom is terrified, and everyone's pretending that this is a celebration and not a strategic grain-merging alliance between 2 sheep-owning families. You're not exactly excited. But weddings used to mean dancing real joyous, unregulated moving. Music flowers, stumbling uncles, at least before the church started handing out modesty scrolls at every gathering like holy pamphlets of disapproval. You arrive at the village green where the ceremony's being held. Everything is decorated in beige, not ivory, not cream, just beige. Apparently, it's the safest color, won't tempt demons, offend saints, or cause spontaneous waltzing. You find a spot near the bread table, the highlight of any medieval event, and watch as the couple says vows with all the enthusiasm of 2 people promising to split a shovel. And then the moment comes, the feast. Tables are pulled out. Platters of barley pies and stewed turnips are laid down. A jug of cider is poured cautiously. And for a brief moment, hope stirs. Maybe someone will hum. Maybe someone will tap a spoon. But no. The priest stands near the cider barrel with his hands behind his back and a look that says, "I will smite your tambourine with holy fire." This village used to dance at weddings. There are stories whispered between spoonfuls of cabbage stew about how people would form circles and spin under moonlight until dawn. They called it binding the spirits. It was meant to bring good luck, fertile fields, and less grumpy goats. Now the only thing bound is your sense of rhythm. The priest begins his usual lecture, how dancing opens the door to temptation, how spinning in circles invites dizziness of both body and soul, and how even clapping can summon dark energies. Someone in the crowd coughs, possibly in rebellion. And then, as if summoned by the spirit of irony, a child starts clapping, just once. But it echoes. The priest narrows his eyes. Who dares awaken the forces? It was Timothy, age 6. He immediately hides under the pie table. The wedding crowd shifts awkwardly. Someone sneezes. You pretend to chew bread, even though it's mostly air and regret. What's wild is that this fear isn't just local, it's historical. In many parts of medieval Europe, Weddings were hotbeds of potential sin, not just for the obvious reasons two young people, some mead in a barn, but because the post-ceremony dancing could spiral into moral panic. Records show that entire village councils debated how to manage wedding revelries. Some suggested imposing a tax on music. Others proposed pre-approved dances with appropriate leg movement. In 15th century Nuremberg, there was a limit on how many people could dance at once, because apparently the sixth dancer was when the devil arrived. And here's a juicy twist. Dancing wasn't always banned at noble weddings. In fact, in royal courts, dance was expected. Lavish, choreographed, but it had to be performed correctly, in carefully practiced steps, with rules and distance, and no accidental flirtation. The waltz hadn't been invented yet, but social anxiety sure had. In short, if you danced wrong, you were a sinner. If you danced right, you were just rich. Back at the wedding, someone begins to tap their foot under the table. You glance across the bread. It's the bride. Tiny, barely noticeable, but there it is. Tap. You raise an eyebrow. She shrugs. Then the groom does it too. Tap, tap. Soon 3 or 4 others join in hands under table shoes barely brushing dirt. A secret symphony of defiance set to the rhythm of survival and boiled vegetables. You lean forward and whisper to the stranger next to you, "Is this how revolutions start?" They nod solemnly. With rhythm and root vegetables. It's not a dance, not exactly, but it's something. And in a world this tightly wound, something is everything. As the feast winds down, the priest blesses the couple and reminds everyone that marital joy should be silent still and preferably indoors. He does not smile, but you do, because tonight in some barn or field or half-collapsed shed, someone will play a fiddle, someone will stomp their heel, and someone will finally blessedly spin. One historian once wrote that medieval wedding bans on dancing reflected not just fear of temptation, but fear of unity, because when people danced together, they stopped obeying separately. You chew your bread, tapping your fingers just once on the table. No one notices, except Timothy. He claps. Twice. And somewhere the goats raise their heads. It's nearly dusk when you follow the whispers to the edge of the village, the kind of whispers that wrap around your ankles like ivy and tug you somewhere you're not supposed to go. They say a circle was spotted in the barley field. A perfect ring worn into the earth as if 100 feet had moved in unison, and not one of them asked permission. You step off the road and into the tall grass. The air smells like damp soil and curiosity. There's no music, just the rustling of grain and the faint creak of wood from the old scarecrow, who's now moonlighting as the village's least judgmental spectator. You reach at the clearing, the ring. It's real, flattened in a swirl, as if something moved here, quickly, joyfully, and with utter disregard for local ordinances. You bend down and touch the earth. It's warm. Or maybe you just want it to be. A shadow shifts beside you. "I wouldn't stand there too long," says a voice. You look up and find an old woman hunched over a basket of herbs. Her face is lined like a well-read map. She doesn't flinch when you straighten guiltily. "They say the ring's cursed," she adds casually. "Dancers went wild last week. Couldn't stop. Had to be dragged out by their tunics." You ask what happened to them. "Still twitching," she says, plucking a stalk of something that smells suspiciously magical. Or maybe they're just remembering how to live. She walks off without another word. Her goat follows naturally. You stand in the center of the ring, testing your courage, or maybe your ankles. Nothing happens. Yet. Still, your heart beats a little faster. These circles, called fairy rings in folk belief, were said to be places of enchantment. Step inside, and you might dance forever, or vanish, or wake up years later wearing moss and confusion. Local superstition insists these are not just trampled crops, but portals, invitations, traps maybe, but the prettiest kind. Medieval people believed in cursed places the way we believe in potholes, common, inevitable, and very inconvenient if you're in the wrong shoes. Church sermons warned against them. Where the ground forgets the Lord, one text called it. In practice, this meant if a field looks too round and festive, stay out of it. Unless you're a goat. Goats are immune. Interestingly, some scholars argue that these places weren't feared because they were magical, but because they represented something uncontrolled. No church, no Lord, no rules. Just people, earth, and movement. You step out of the ring and shake off the shiver. Maybe it's just a pattern, or maybe it's history tapping you on the shoulder. Later that evening, you overhear some villagers arguing at the alehouse. "It's mushrooms," says one man, smacking his mug on the table. "Grows in rings, makes people dance." "No, no," another chimes in. "It's the Fae." You step inside, and they own your soul. A third nods solemnly. "My cousin's neighbor's cousin once danced in one and married a tree." You back away slowly. At home, you lie awake thinking, what if the cursed fields aren't cursed at all? What if they're just sacred in the wrong language? And here's where things get beautifully academic. Some historians suggest that these cursed circles were actually the remnants of ancient communal dances rituals for planting, harvesting, or seasonal transitions. Over time, as church authority grew, and pagan practices were rewritten as wickedness, the dances became plagues, the circles became portals, and the joy became sin. But there's another theory. One more psychological. It says that in a world where everything is tightly controlled by landlord's priests, even the moon, any space that encourages you to lose yourself, to move without instruction, feels dangerous, maybe cursed, maybe beautiful. In your dreams that night, you see the ring again, except now it's glowing faintly, pulsing with the rhythm of footsteps long forgotten. You see villagers generations old dancing barefoot. No one is watching. No one is afraid. And just before you wake, you see yourself among them, laughing. No goats, though. They're off to the side, clapping. The morning after the ring dream, you wake to bells. Not the usual church ones. These are lighter, faster, almost cheerful, if you didn't know better. It's the bell of the harvest ritual, which means today is the one time of year the villagers are allowed, encouraged even to move their bodies in ways that might look suspiciously like dancing, with very strict rules. You arrive at the fields wearing your cleanest tunic, the one without any enthusiastic soup stains. The villagers gather, many still rubbing sleep from their eyes, but all with that twitchy anticipation of a day where they might legally sway. At the edge of the barley rows stands the harvest leader, a stout woman named Colette, with biceps like church pillars. She holds a wooden staff adorned with garlic ribbons and something that might be a dried eel, a symbol of fertility apparently. Today she announces we honor the ground, we offer movement, but only in the correct sequence. Everyone nods solemnly. The correct sequence is etched into everyone's memory, like a recipe they're too scared to modify. 4 steps forward, 1 back, arms up, Then touch the dirt with your left hand, but not your right. Never your right. That invites chaos or weevils. This is the sacred harvest dance, or more accurately, the sacred harvest shuffle. It's functional, reverent, completely joyless. Still, people do it because they believe. And also because last year, old Giels skipped a step, and the following week, a cow exploded. Probably unrelated, but why risk it? As the procession begins, you join in. Step, 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 back, raise arms, left hand to dirt. It's like slow motion hokey pokey with a side of superstition. And yet somehow it's beautiful. The sun filters through the barley, the wind whistles a faint tune, and for a fleeting moment it feels like dance again. Not the forbidden kind, the ancient kind, the kind passed down in knees and ankles before books and scrolls took over. Children giggle when they forget a step, adults gasp. Colette glares. After the ritual, everyone shares cider. There's laughter soft and careful. A few claps. No one reports them, but you notice something peculiar. In every group, there's always one person who knows the steps too well. Not just the harvest steps, but other strange ones. Spiral stomps movements that don't belong to any official tradition. They practice in corners behind carts when they think no one's watching. You ask Colette about it. There are families, she says carefully, that carry older dances. Not forbidden, just unregistered. You blink. She continues. They say, if you do them right, the wheat grows sweeter. You wonder if this is rebellion or preservation. Because here's the truth. Even in a world ruled by parchment and fear, people don't forget movement. They pass it down in chores, lullabies, and chores that pretend to be lullabies. Dance doesn't die. It hibernates in rituals, in ceremonies, in harvests. Some scholars think these structured dances, like the one you just did, were created by the church to replace older, wilder ones. They gave people just enough rhythm to keep them calm without letting joy get too close to the surface. Others argue that these rituals were always part of rural life, co-opted, but never fully erased. That every stiff procession is the ghost of something looser, something freer. You believe them because when you walked in rhythm today, the ground felt different. It gave a little, like it remembered too. Back at home, you practice one of the secret steps. You saw a little side hop with a flick at the end. It feels alive. The goat watches unimpressed. Tomorrow, the fields will be just fields again. But tonight, the dust still hangs in the air, like a memory trying not to fade. And you start to understand why dancing was feared. Because it plants things no law can uproot. A week passes, and just when you've settled back into your routine of legally non-expressive movements, a parchment arrives delivered by a courier with a feathered cap, so elaborate it deserves its own address. It's an invitation, sealed with blue wax and stamped with a dancing bear. You've been summoned to observe the annual gathering of the Guild of Recognized Dancers. You blink twice. That's a real thing. Apparently, yes. There's a guild, with rules, with hierarchy, with presumably very expensive shoes. You travel to the city, where the event is held, its name written in calligraphy, so dense even the town crier gave up halfway through. The hall is vast and echoey, lit with chandeliers made of antlers and ambition. Inside, rows of dancers line the walls, each in formal attire. Velvet, brocade, embroidery so intense it probably caused at least 3 weavers to quit mid-thread. You sit cautiously on a wooden bench labeled Observer. No spinning allowed. The ceremony begins with a speech from the Grand Pivot, a title that makes you want to simultaneously applaud and giggle. He wears a doublet covered in tiny bells and speaks with the authority of someone who once did a pirouette in front of a duke. We, he intones, move with purpose. We move with dignity. We do not wiggle. We do not flail. A small but very disappointed part of you deflates. This is not the joyful chaos of wedding stomps or barley field shuffles. This is regulation dancing. Controlled, precise, auditioned. You soon learn that only certified dances are allowed. The pavon, the estampi, the saltarello, but only on odd-numbered Thursdays. Each dancer must be license-trained, and if gossip is to be believed capable of gliding across marble without wrinkling their hem. This is not the dancing you know, but it's the dancing the elite approve of. And that's the point. See, in the later Middle Ages, dancing was not universally banned. In the courts of nobles, it was expected, especially among the fashionable and powerful, but it had to follow rules. Dance manuals were written complete with diagrams, steps, and posture corrections. There were entire professions built around teaching aristocrats how not to look like enthusiastic frogs. If you danced well, you were refined. If you danced poorly, you were a risk to wallpaper and social rank. You watch a performance, 6 dancers in a formation so geometrically perfect, it could be used to measure grain. Their movements are elegant, yes, but joyless. Every smile looks practiced. Every step lands like a legal document. You whisper to the person next to you, "Is this art or military training?" They reply, "Yes." Afterward, you approach one of the dancers, a woman named Isabeau, who has been rehearsing the same 4 steps since January. You ask her what she thinks of folk dances. She pauses. Then, dangerous. Too free. They forget the spine is not a hose. And that right there is the difference. Folk dance is for survival, for harvest, for courtship, and grieving, and screaming at the sky when the soup burns. Guild dancing is for showing you belong, that you know the steps, that your joy has been pre-approved by someone wearing a sash. Some historians believe the rise of dance guilds was an attempt to control movement, to institutionalize joy, to gatekeep rhythm. Because when you regulate the body, you regulate the spirit. You leave the event just before the awards are handed out. Best heel point, least unwanted flourish, most upright posture while bowing. Outside the street, musicians play something livelier, unlicensed, irregular. 2 children spin in circles until they fall over. You smile, because somewhere under all the rules and diagrams, the original heartbeat of dance still thumps wild wobbly and completely off book. You walk home in the dark, stepping softly to your own beat. No one gives you a ribbon for it, but you sleep better than the Grand Pivot. The next morning, you find a note pinned to your door. It's written in delicate ink, sealed with lavender wax, and ends with the phrase, "Please come dressed modestly and do not bring percussion." Ah, another summons. This time, it's to observe a public hearing, a trial of sorts. Not for theft, not for sorcery, for dancing. You arrive at the town square to find a small wooden platform has been constructed, complete with a chair, for the accused, a panel of somber-faced magistrates, and a surprisingly enthusiastic crowd who have clearly brought snacks. Apparently, dancing trials draw more attendance than Sunday sermons. The accused is a young woman named Leah. She sits calmly, hands folded, expression unreadable. Her crime, excessive motion of the lower limbs in proximity to a tavern. You lean toward the man next to you. She danced. He nods gravely. Worse. She danced while smiling. Ah, a repeat offender. The charges are read aloud in impressive detail, including such phrases as improper heel placement, visible wrist enthusiasm, and suspicious musical humming. The final accusation causes an audible gasp. She revealed the ankle. That's it. The trial might as well be over. You watch as witnesses are called, none of whom saw the dance, but all of whom are deeply sure it happened. A priest quotes scripture about the dangers of wanton movement. A merchant insists the dance made his cider go flat. Then Leah is asked to speak. She rises slowly, calmly, and says, "Only this I moved because I was happy." That is not a crime. The silence is thunderous, except for a baby who laughs. The council deliberates. In the meantime, let's talk about how we got here. In many parts of medieval Europe, dancing wasn't just policed in practice, it was monitored in spirit. Authorities, both civic and religious, had strong opinions about how bodies should behave in public, especially women's bodies, and especially if those women were unmarried, outspoken, or heaven forbid graceful. Even the appearance of delight was grounds for suspicion. A woman dancing alone, dangerous. A woman dancing with a man, more dangerous. A woman dancing with other women while laughing and clapping, clearly a coven. Church teachings often framed the female body as inherently seductive, a kind of moral trap wrapped in linen. And when that body moved freely, rhythmically, publicly, well, now it was a moving moral trap. And those were the worst kind. Even outside religious contexts, there was a strong belief that joy needed regulation, that it should occur only in the presence of male supervision inside controlled rituals, and never near a wine barrel after sundown. Dancing in this sense was not just a physical act, it was a challenge. A visible rhythmic statement that said, "I own this body, and I choose to move it." And that was simply too much. Some local laws even prohibited certain styles of movement. A 15th century ordinance from the Low Countries banned dances that incite laughter or looseness. The punishment: fines, exile, or forced recitation of psalms in itchy garments. But here's the strangest part. Men were sometimes punished too, though usually only if they danced inappropriately with women, or if they wore tights that left too little to the imagination. Yes, that was an actual concern. Back in the square, the magistrates return. The verdict: suspension from feast days for 3 months. No public laughter. No footwear with jingle. The crowd murmurs. Leah bows slightly, not submissively, just enough to say, "I see your decision. I don't accept it." As she steps down, a child tugs her sleeve. "Will you teach me the steps?" She smiles. Later, in the orchard. That night, you walk past the tavern. The moon is full. The grass is soft. And in the distance behind the trees, you hear it. Footsteps. Laughter. A rhythm born not from defiance, but from refusal to be still. So the question remains, one that historians still dance around. Were these laws really about piety and control, or about fear? Fear of what might happen when people, especially women, stop holding back. You don't have the answer, but your feet do. It starts with a rumor. A merchant from Strasbourg arrives in your village, soaked from rain and full of stories. Not about crop prices or road thieves, but about something far stranger, a city overcome by dancing. You lean in. Hundreds, he whispers, eyes wide, in the streets, twisting, leaping, collapsing, and not one of them could stop. You pause mid-spoonful of lentil stew. That can't be real, except it is. The dancing plague of 1518 is one of history's most bizarre footnotes, and it's not even an exaggeration. In July of that year, a woman named Frau Trophea walked out into the streets of Strasbourg and started to dance. No music, no partner, just movement. And she didn't stop. She danced for days. People watched. Then they joined. Within a week, dozens were dancing in the streets, some for hours, some for days, some until they collapsed from exhaustion, some until they, well, stopped forever. The local authorities did what any logical, well-informed government would do. They built a stage and hired musicians to play more music in the hopes that it would help the dancers dance it out. Spoiler, it did not work. You imagine the scene: now cobbled streets filled with bodies in motion, some laughing, some weeping, all compelled by something no one could explain. It must have looked like a festival, or a punishment, or both. You ask the merchant what the cause was. He shrugs. Cursed bread, demons, a heat wave, moral decay, excessive enthusiasm. All were mentioned. And here's where it gets truly delightful. Scholars still don't agree on what happened. Some blame ergot poisoning, a mold that grows on rye and can cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, and a general sense that your feet belong to someone else. Sounds plausible until you realize that many dancers weren't delirious. They were coherent, terrified, and utterly unable to stop. Others argue it was mass hysteria, or, as modern historians prefer to call it, mass psychogenic illness. In simpler terms, everyone lost it at the same time because things were that bad, which feels about right for 1518. The early 16th century was not exactly a chill era. War, famine, disease, the bubonic plague popping in and out like an uninvited uncle. People were stretched thin, spiritually, emotionally, and definitely agriculturally. In that context, dancing wasn't just rebellion. It was escape, or maybe collapse, or maybe a prayer in motion. You wonder, what if these people weren't cursed or sick, but overwhelmed? What if their bodies were simply responding to a world too heavy to carry, standing still? You walk through your village and picture it. What if it happened here? You see old Helene doing a frantic two-step muttering psalms in rhythm. The goat doing an enthusiastic hoof shuffle. Children turning cartwheels until they crash into barrels of pickled beets. And in the center, someone like you, trying not to join, trying not to hear the beat that isn't playing, but is absolutely there. The Strasbourg authorities eventually outlawed music, shut down dance halls, and even banned wearing red shoes for a while. Because obviously red shoes are to blame. Some dancers were taken to a shrine in the mountains where they prayed to Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers, epileptics, and people generally out of sync with polite society. They were offered holy water and a strict prescription of stillness. Did it work? Maybe. Or maybe the storm just passed. What's most compelling isn't the cause, but the aftermath. No one wanted to talk about it. No one wrote dance manuals based on the event. It wasn't romanticized. It was swept away like spilled wine. But the echo remains in books, in footnotes, in the part of your mind that wonders what it would feel like to move with such intensity that the world itself blurred. Back at the village square, you find a few people trying clumsy steps behind the bakery. Not plague-level dancing, just tentative, hopeful movement. And you don't stop them. Because maybe dancing isn't always rebellion, or joy, or madness. Maybe sometimes it's just necessary. One historian once asked, did the dancers of Strasbourg lose their minds? Or did they find a truth their minds weren't ready to admit? You don't know, but you take off your shoes, just in case. This morning, you decide to stretch, just a little. A casual twist at the waist, a roll of the shoulders, one tentative toe point toward the firewood pile. It's innocent. Until your neighbor walks by and mutters, stretching is just pre-dancing. You freeze mid-lunge like a guilty cat. Because yes, even movement that might lead to dancing is suspicious now. Not officially illegal, but watch-listed. You sigh, turn back inside, and continue your day with the stiff grace of a tax collector doing yoga. But the idea lingers. Has even the act of staying limber become a risk? You decide to test the theory. You head toward the garden path and start your exercise routine. You're not dancing. You're practicing functional body mobility, totally permitted, until old Hélène sees you. That's heretical lunging, she says, tightening her shawl like a noose of propriety. You've been spending too much time with urban types. You smile politely and move into a deep squat. She gasps. You have now entered the gray zone movement without justification. It's not quite forbidden, but it's unnerving. Historically, this isn't far off. In many places during the late Middle Ages, even casual gestures could be scrutinized. A flourish of the wrist, a bounce in your step, or a particularly cheerful spin while collecting herbs could land you in a disciplinary chat with the local priest. The church preached against fleshly delight, and nothing broadcasted fleshly delight, like someone skipping to the market like a cartoon nymph. But it wasn't just the clergy. Communities policed each other. Dancing could make your neighbors uneasy. It implied you were enjoying life a little too much, and no one wanted to be the village that attracted wandering moral inspectors. You remember your cousin from a town upriver who got reported for frolicsome laundry hanging. She had rhythm. The clothes didn't. Even exercise, when done with flair, was frowned upon. Medieval society did not admire toned calves unless they belonged to someone who walked 30 miles for wheat. Intentional movement was indulgent. And indulgence led to chaos. And chaos, well, that's just dancing in fancier shoes. You walk to the well and pass a group of women churning butter. They're humming. One of them taps her foot. Another sways, just slightly, with the rhythm of the churn. It's hypnotic, wholesome, terrifying. Then someone from across the field shouts, "Careful, that's how it starts." The women freeze. One quickly mutters a prayer. Another blesses the butter. The tapping foot is immediately relocated to a different rhythm, hoofing turnips. And yet, despite all the panic, people want to move. Their bodies remember joy, even when their minds have been trained to fear it. Later that day, you pass a boy playing a pipe near the woods. Nothing fancy, just a tune. But his fingers are fast, and his eyes glint with the kind of mischief that usually ends in movement or goat theft. You ask him why he's playing. He shrugs. Sometimes I don't want to talk. I want to wiggle. honestly fair. Modern scholars, looking back at this time, note the incredible pressure medieval people faced to behave. Everything was monitored: posture, tone of voice, eyebrow angles. To express too much of anything, joy, sadness, music, even flexibility, was to risk being accused of being excessive. And excessive, in the eyes of the community, was dangerously close to different. But here's the catch: the more restrictions people faced, the more inventive they became. Whistling dances, foot-only jigs, the pocket prance, where someone wriggled their fingers in rhythm inside their coat. One nobleman even commissioned non-dance parties gatherings where everyone sat still and thought about dancing but did not move. You suspect he had very muscular eyebrows. The line between exercise and expression became blurry. Purposeful stretching became a loophole. People started calling it devotional bending or agricultural alignment. Anything but what it was: a sneaky little dance in disguise. Back at home, you try a few steps after dark. Your shutters are closed, your floor is creaky, but your spirit is warm. The goat watches from the corner, judging, or possibly keeping rhythm, and you wonder how many people, across the centuries, have danced in secret, alone, quietly, safely, behind walls, just to remind themselves they're alive. So here's the debate. Scholars still whisper: did the suppression of dancing lead to more discipline or more imaginative rebellion? You do a celebratory shoulder roll, then another. You're not dancing. You're aligning your soul with style. You receive word today, delivered by an out-of-breath pigeon who's clearly questioning its career choices, that a local nobleman has passed a new decree: no dancing within 40 feet of any castle courtyard or noble carriage, especially during diplomatic events, feasts, or Thursdays. You squint. Thursdays. Apparently, something happened. Rumor has it a minor Viscount attempted a spin during a banquet and crashed directly into a cheese platter in the bishop's hat. Scandalous. Naturally, you investigate. You travel to the castle grounds, blending in with a troupe of traveling soup vendors. Don't ask, it's a long story involving parsley and disguise. The air is thick with perfume and powdered dignity. Nobles parade in stiff brocade, each step a study in posture and privilege. You've never seen so many people move so slowly with such self-importance. Then in the great hall, it begins the formal procession. Each guest steps forward in time to a stately tune played on a suspiciously mournful harp. It's not dancing, of course. It's courtly movement, but you see it. The foot flicks, the carefully measured glides, the one lady who definitely throws in a forbidden twirl before pretending to sneeze. It's dancing. Just very expensive and deeply repressed dancing. You whisper to a steward nearby, "Isn't this against the rules?" He leans in, smiling wearily. "It's only illegal if someone falls." Ah, the politics of dance in noble courts were always murky. On one hand, the elite loved to dance lavish balls, choreographed performances, competitive pavane strutting. It was how alliances were forged, marriages hinted, and peacock feathers metaphorically fluffed. But it had to be perfect, not too lively, not too common, certainly not spontaneous. Any movement not sanctioned by the official court dancing master could be seen as gauche or worse, embarrassing. You learn that the recent ban stems from a particularly dramatic incident. During a diplomatic feast last month, a visiting lord attempted a volta, a leaping turn usually performed by trained dancers. Unfortunately, he wasn't trained. He leapt, he twirled, he landed in a duck. The duck is fine. The lord's dignity, Less so. The fallout was swift. A decree was drafted. Shoes were inspected. A goose was interrogated, wrong bird, but very cooperative. Now all exuberant movement is banned during feasts, which means no hop skips or anything resembling glee within visual range of the royal cheese plate. You can't help but find this funny, because for all their power and opulence, nobles are just as afraid of embarrassment as peasants are of demons. Some historians argue that these restrictions weren't just about decorum, they were about power. In a world where everything was hierarchy, dancing broke the line. Two bodies spinning together blurred the distinction between titles. A well-executed turn could make a minor baron look more graceful than a duke, and that was dangerous. Others suggest dancing was restricted because it distracted from noble thoughts. That is things like warfare, marriage contracts, and how best to glare at soup. Still behind the brocade and powdered wigs people longed to move. Secret dance clubs emerged among courtiers, small gatherings in cellars where music was played in whispers, and everyone practiced their steps wearing socks so as not to wake the guards. They called it the Velvet Rebellion. You imagine it now, a group of powdered aristocrats in silk undergarments, spinning in near silence, holding candelabras and hope. Back in the great hall, the harpist switches to a livelier tune. A hush falls. One man drunk on cider and personal ambition dares to clap. Once. The steward gasps. The Viscountess, beside him, clutches her pearls. You wait, but nothing happens. And then very slowly, as if moved by a force beyond etiquette, several guests tap their heels. Subtle, syncopated. You don't know whether to cheer or curtsy. When the feast ends, the steward turns to you. Nothing illegal happened, he says firmly. You nod. Of course. Then he winks. But tomorrow, there's a wedding, and someone will forget themselves. So here's the debate. Did noble dancing restrictions preserve dignity, or just hide the chaos better? You leave the castle under the cover of dusk, practicing a very legal heel pivot. The cheese survives. This time, the town square is unusually quiet this morning, which you've learned is almost always a bad sign. Quiet means no market shouts, no goat drama, and most suspiciously, no children playing hop and skip near the well. You round the corner and see them, the children lined up in perfect silence, hands behind their backs under the watchful eye of Sister Gertrude and her broom of moral correction. It's dance suppression day at the parish school. You sit on a nearby bench, trying not to make eye contact with the broom. Apparently, someone reported that the children were singing a suspiciously melodic skipping rhyme with hand gestures. And the worst part, some of them rhymed on beat. You watch as one small girl squirms in place like her legs are remembering a tune her mouth isn't allowed to sing. Later that afternoon, you hear the full story. A week ago, a group of children began to gather near the edge of the village. At first, it was harmless, a few songs, some claps. But then they started spinning in circles, chanting verses they barely understood. Ring around the crow's nest. Step to the sun. Turn to the riverbank. Run, children, run. It's not exactly subversive, but it feels wrong to the adults. The rhythm is too tight. The unity too eerie. Some parents said the children weren't laughing. They were dancing with blank expressions as if in a trance. Naturally, the explanation offered was possession. Ah, yes, the classic medieval diagnosis. If a child is doing something rhythmic without adult supervision, clearly demons are involved. You visit one of the families. The mother looks tired. The child looks wistful. She only remembers parts of it, the mother says. But when she hums the tune, the dog runs in circles. You blink. like it knows the steps. The child nods. He's better at it than me. She's not joking. This isn't an isolated case. All across Europe, stories from the Middle Ages pop up about children spontaneously dancing, sometimes in groups, sometimes across entire towns. One legend speaks of the Children's Crusade, where thousands of children marched across Europe in 1212. Some scholars believe it was a kind of pilgrimage. Others suspect mass hysteria, and a few argue it may have involved rhythmic movement bordering on dance. In some tellings, the children sang as they marched. In others, they couldn't stop. One dark version suggests they were lured by a figure playing a pipe and were never seen again. Sound familiar? That's right. The Pied Piper of Hamelin. While it lives today as a fable, its roots lie in a possibly real event, a mysterious disappearance of children from a German town in the 13th century. Whether they danced away, marched in fervor, or simply vanished, we may never know. But the connection remains: music children, uncontrollable movement, and adults who can't make sense of it. You return to the village square. The children are released for recess. Within 5 minutes, they're playing a new game, freeze dance, but reversed. If anyone stops moving, they're out. You watch amused. Then you notice the adults peering from windows. Some are concerned. A few whisper. Sister Gertrude clutches her broom like a sword. You step in gently. They're just playing. She narrows her eyes. They're too coordinated. You sigh. They're children. Coordination is accidental. But even you know that's not true. When kids dance together, something happens. Something old. Something that doesn't ask permission. It's not rebellion, it's memory. Movement passed down in secret rhymes and playground claps, too quick for history to pin down. One scholar once wrote, "Children are the last true dancers. Before shame, before rules, before they're told their joy must be licensed. Back in your home, you find an old skipping rhyme, scribbled on parchment, something your grandmother used to chant. You try it. You clap twice. Your knee bounces. You stop. But you smile. Because tomorrow, the children will dance again. Not in defiance, not in trance, just because they're children. And no one, not even Sister Gertrude and her legendary broom, can take that away for long. It's raining today, the kind of soft, steady drizzle that turns dirt roads into polite disasters and makes your boots sound like overcooked porridge. You don't mind. The rain keeps people indoors, which means fewer suspicious glances when you practice your absolutely legal and completely non-dance-like stretches in the garden. You're halfway through a shoulder roll when a stranger appears at your gate. She wears a wide-brimmed hood, carries a satchel full of scrolls, and introduces herself in a whisper. "I'm Isadora, traveling physician." Also, she glances around, lowers her voice. "Interested in movement disorders." That last part catches your attention. She's not here to diagnose you, she explains, but to study a curious phenomenon she's been tracing across villages. People who claim they can't stop dancing, not joyful dancing, not festive, something darker, compulsive. You offer her warm broth and a seat by the fire. She pulls out maps notes and a tiny bottle of what she calls melancholy salve. Don't ask her. Goat accidentally drank one, and now it only walks sideways. Isadora tells you stories. One of a man in Burgundy who flailed so wildly in church, they tied him to a pew, only to find the pew dancing too. Another of a woman in Flanders who claimed she wasn't moving at all, but was being moved as if her limbs belonged to someone else. Isadora has a theory, not about demons, not about cursed rye, about trauma. Maybe she says, this is how grief moves. She believes that some of the so-called dancing plagues were the body's response to unspeakable stress, that after war, famine, and plague something had to give, and sometimes what gave were people's feet. Her view isn't unique. In fact, some modern historians support the idea that these outbreaks of uncontrolled movement were psychosomatic responses to collective anxiety. Communities already on edge, weakened by suffering, may have unconsciously mimicked each other's symptoms, what we'd now call mass psychogenic illness. But Isadora pushes further. She suspects that dance in these cases wasn't illness. It was survival, a desperate physical attempt to reassert life rhythm and control when everything else had collapsed. You tell her about the children, the court banquets, the barley field ring. She listens, takes notes, nods. Then she says something that stays with you. Not all dances come from joy. Some come from needing to feel anything at all. That night, as the rain taps its slow lullaby on your roof, you try to sleep. But your mind is pacing, so you rise, light a candle, and move just a little. A foot slide, a hip sway, a spin that's barely more than a sigh. You're not smiling, but you're breathing. And in the flicker of candlelight, you finally understand something that history books often miss, that dance doesn't need to be pretty, or planned, or celebratory. It only needs to happen. Because sometimes stillness is heavier than motion, and sometimes dancing isn't rebellion or celebration. It's the only language you have left when words fail. Isadora leaves the next day, vanishing into the fog, with her scrolls, her goat, and her melancholy salves. She leaves behind a note. Keep moving, especially when they say not to. The harvest has ended, and the air now carries the smell of damp wood, burned bread, and old fabric clinging to the last of summer. The fields are brown. The sky is pewter. Everyone walks slower, speaks quieter. Even the goats look reflective. And yet, as the year's end approaches, something unusual happens. A notice is pinned to the town board. Winter fair. One night only. Dancing permitted. You stare at it like it might sprout legs and run. It's official. Sealed with wax. Signed by the mayor, the priest, and most surprisingly, Sister Gertrude, who must have been heavily bribed or moderately enchanted. Either way, it's real. Dancing. Legal. Tonight, the village erupts in quiet disbelief. Not excitement yet, just blinking confusion. You hear someone ask, "Will there be supervision?" Another, "What if I accidentally enjoy it?" A third, whispering near the bakery, "What do we even wear? Are shoes allowed?" You help decorate the square, stringing up lanterns made from dried gourds and old parchment. Someone tunes a lute. A local brewer donates cider on the condition that no one jig near the barrels. Night falls. The lanterns flicker. The band plays their first tentative tune, something safe, historical, and deeply unimpressive. You count at least 17 different kinds of hesitation in the crowd. People sway like they're being tested for balance. But then someone laughs, out loud. And a young couple, too young to remember, the last band starts to dance, not wildly, just together, gently, as if they've never known that moving could be dangerous. That's when the square changes. A ripple runs through it. Feet begin to tap. Shoulders loosen. Eyes crinkle. You see old Hélène shuffle slightly to the left and pretend she didn't. The baker tries a spin and crashes into his own bread cart. It is perfect. You join in. No one arrests you. No one frowns. Even Sister Gertrude taps her broom in time. Just once. But it counts. And this perhaps is the secret. The joy was never gone. It was just waiting for the rules to forget. Dancing in this moment becomes something simple. No plague, no punishment, no hidden cellar revolutions or sacred barley rituals. Just people, moving, together. Later that night, you sit on a bench, breathless and sore in the best way. Lantern light glows against the mist. The goat is asleep. Someone sings off-key. No one corrects them. You think of the years before, of forbidden feasts, twitching outbreaks, courtly collapses, broom-based surveillance. Of people who danced anyway, who risked fines, exile side-eyes, and supernatural suspicion. You think of Isadora and her whisper, "Keep moving." And you think of this, that maybe dancing never truly needed permission. Just space. One historian once asked whether medieval dancing bands ever truly worked. The answer, you now know, is no. Because even when dance was outlawed, it lived. In the fingers of women stirring soup with a sway. In the foot of a boy, bouncing as he drew chickens. In the breath of a crowd, too tired to speak, but not too tired to tap. And now, as you rise from your bench, and join the last circle forming in the square. You feel it. Not rebellion, not defiance. Just life. Rhythmic and ridiculous, and deeply, beautifully human. You take someone's hand. You move. And for once, no one says, "Stop." So now, the lights are low. The music has faded, and the village square is quiet again. Just the soft creak of old benches and the sigh of fabric settling after a long evening of forbidden steps remembered. You lie back, maybe in bed, maybe just in your mind, and think about all the people across time who danced when they weren't supposed to, who moved gently in kitchens while the soup boiled, who tapped out rhythms on wooden floors long after curfews, who whispered joy into their own bones even when the world said no. Because that's the thing about dancing. It isn't just for celebration. It's for surviving. For staying human when things feel too tight, too silent, too full of rules. And maybe tonight, you feel a little like them. Tired, hopeful, quiet in your body, but still gently humming underneath. A slow rhythm barely there, but real. You don't need music. You don't need permission. You only need to breathe. So let yourself breathe now softly. Let the day fall away. Let your thoughts settle like lanterns on still water. And if somewhere in your mind, your feet begin to move, just a little, just a quiet shuffle, a barely there sway, that's okay too. That's memory. That's joy, asking nothing in return. That's your body saying we made it through. That's the story. For tonight, may your dreams be filled with wonder and peace. Hey friends, tonight, let's explore a tale that's been gently simmering on the back burner of history. You wrap yourself in a soft blanket maybe with a warm drink nearby. No judgment if it's soup. But be warned, tonight's story might just make you question what's in your bowl. Because in the Middle Ages, soup wasn't just soup. It was suspicion. It was scandal. It was borderline sorcery. So, before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Dim those lights, fire up a fan for that cozy background sound, and let's settle in for the journey ahead. You're walking through a damp stone kitchen in a tiny 13th century hamlet. The kind where the ceiling beams are low enough to threaten your forehead, and the fire is the only warmth in a room that smells like boiled turnips and centuries of confusion. There's a pot on the fire. It's steaming, bubbling, innocent, right? Not quite. In this village, people don't trust anything that mixes water and fire too well, especially if vegetables are involved. They whisper things like the roots must remain whole, and boiling breaks the purity of the plant. To boil a carrot was to some minds to unravel the divine order. Water, after all, was seen as sacred and mysterious, too close to baptism, too ready to be twisted by human hands. You crouch near the pot, curious. A woman stirs it, slowly glancing around, as though someone might leap out of the shadows and declare her a heretic. The soup is little more than garlic cabbage and hopes, but back then that was radical. Because the very act of combining ingredients into one pot was seen by some as dangerously blended, and blending in medieval logic led directly to sin and indigestion. A local friar, small, hunched, with a voice like dry twigs, had once preached that soup made people forget moderation. One sip becomes three, he warned, and then thou art fat with gluttony and sloth. It was his second most passionate sermon. The first was about chairs with cushions. But here's the thing, people didn't stop eating soup. They just got sneakier. You follow a boy who's smuggling a ladleful of broth behind the chapel. He pours it into a cracked bowl, looks up at the sky, and says something between a prayer and an apology. You've just witnessed the first known instance of underground soup consumption. And this fear wasn't isolated. Across regions, different flavors of paranoia simmered. In one monastery, the head abbot forbade the use of onions because he believed their layers symbolized the temptations of the flesh. In another, they excommunicated a cook for stirring counterclockwise. All of this might seem ridiculous now, but in the medieval mind, the world was balanced on symbols, omens, and rituals. Soup blurred boundaries. It wasn't meat, but it wasn't not meat. It wasn't liquid, but it wasn't solid. It was a culinary limbo. And what's worse, it was warm. Warmth was a suspicious comfort in an age that valued spiritual cold showers. There's even a record from 1273 where a bishop referred to a suspicious illness as the curse of the copper pot, a vague affliction believed to arise when people consumed stew from unblessed vessels. Not exactly a peer-reviewed diagnosis. You might ask, wasn't the church focused on bigger things than soup? Sure. But soup was daily. Soup was intimate. And anything that entered your mouth, especially with pleasure, was never just about food. It was about control. Now for a fun detail, there's a preserved folk song from the Alsace region that warns young girls not to marry a man who eats too much barley soup, because he will forget your name, but remember the spoon. It's unclear whether this is poetic or just deeply confusing. But it tells you one thing, soup was personal. And here comes the academic twist. Historians still debate whether these fears were rooted in theology or just in the discomfort of too many things mixing too quickly. Was it about the soul or about sanitation? Either way, tonight your bowl of lentil soup might taste just a little more rebellious. You wake up in a hay-filled loft above a small inn that smells like cabbage and slightly damp wool. It's morning in medieval France, and the hearth downstairs is already crackling. You tiptoe down the creaky stairs, careful not to disturb the stable cat curled like a cinnamon bun on the landing. A woman is ladling soup into a wooden bowl for a traveler. Nothing unusual until you see the local priest walk in and immediately freeze, nostrils flaring, as if he's just detected something sinful. It's not poison. It's not blasphemy. It's beef broth. You blink. He blinks. Then he whispers, "Meat in the morning is a whisper from the devil." Tonight we discover that soup, especially when it contains meat, was seen by many clergy members not just as food, but as moral hazard. It was, in a way, too efficient, too satisfying, too slippery. You didn't have to chew much. You didn't have to work for it. You just slurped. That ease, that warmth, that fullness in the belly without suffering, highly suspicious. Because in the Middle Ages, the body wasn't supposed to be comfortable. At least not if you wanted to keep your soul in check. By the time the soup hit your tongue, you were already halfway to gluttony. Add in a little butter and some slow-cooked marrow, and congratulations, you are now on a spiritual water slide straight to sloth. 2 of the 7 deadly sins in a single spoonful. Impressive. You're invited that afternoon to the priest's midday lecture, held as always in the draftiest corner of the chapel. His theme, the dangers of deliciousness. His examples, soup, followed by cheese, but mostly soup. And while that might sound a bit extreme, it wasn't just about the food. It was about desire. And soup was desire's accomplice. The church taught that discipline was divine. Every comfort, every pleasure, every indulgence, even one as simple as broth, was a gateway to spiritual laziness. One monk wrote in his journal that hot soup weakens the backbone of the righteous. Another warned that eating soup on a cold day could lead to bodily swoon and temptation towards second helpings. You almost admire the specificity, and yet, people loved soup. They kept making it. They kept finding little ways around the restrictions. Some began adding accidentally dropped bits of bacon to their lentil stews. Others claimed their chicken broth was medicinal. One rather creative nun developed a stew so bland it passed as holy porridge, but once the abbess fell asleep, she snuck in spices she grew behind the cloister wall. A culinary rebel in a wimple. Meanwhile, the tension grew. There are records of entire communities being scolded from the pulpit for over-soupening their fast days. There were debates. If a soup is thin enough to drink, is it a meal or a beverage? Could one sip soup before Mass and still claim to be fasting? Was chewing required to break divine discipline? One priest trying to clarify things declared that only food that resists the tongue is acceptable. Honestly, that's just begging for confusion. Then there's the case of the Lent broth trials, where a cook in Avignon was interrogated for serving pea soup with hidden duck fat during a penitential season. When accused, he famously responded, "The Lord would not give us flavor if he did not wish us to taste it." The tribunal was not amused, and yet there was always a loophole. Some parishioners began claiming their hearty soups were penitential puddings. Others invented new names: holy broth, liquid humility, and grain prayers. You can't be sinful if you're technically rebranding your stew as a spiritual exercise, right? Which brings us to tonight's curious fact. In some monastic orders, soup was only permitted if served cold. This was not for safety. It was because warmth was deemed too indulgent. Cold soup, spiritually safe, even if emotionally devastating. Imagine sipping cold cabbage water at dawn while someone chants psalms behind you. Now, imagine doing that every day for 10 years. Makes your microwave dinner feel like a banquet, doesn't it? And here's the delightful oddity. Some monasteries allowed soup, but banned spoons. Why? Because spoons made it too easy. You had to slurp directly from the bowl or use a piece of bread as a makeshift scoop. This kept the act humble, messy, but humble. Modern scholars still debate this whole soup situation. Was it about calorie control social hierarchy? Or was it just the church trying to regulate pleasure one ladle at a time? No matter the answer, one thing's certain. Somewhere in a stone kitchen, a medieval cook was whispering to herself, "Just one more carrot. God will understand." The wind howls outside a cottage that looks like it was built by someone who had never met a straight line. You're inside, hunched next to a fireplace that spits more smoke than heat, watching a very determined peasant woman drop root vegetables into a pot. Each thunk of a turnip is an act of defiance, because tonight's soup is being made in direct violation of local church suggestions delivered loudly from the pulpit with all the subtlety of a thunderclap. You see, during this particular Lent season, the bishop declared that soup must contain no stimulants of the flesh. A confusing phrase. Does he mean spices, salt parsnips cut provocatively? No one knows. What they do know is that he frowned directly at this cottage when he said it. The woman stirs slowly, like she's daring the saints to blink first. And into that boiling pot goes a hint of garlic, some mustard greens, a suspiciously rich broth. It smells incredible. It smells criminal. Because this is the part the church didn't exactly sing from the rooftops: food had power. And soup was an alchemical transformation. Fire plus water plus Earth's bounty. It blurred the lines between nature and culture, sustenance and pleasure, body and soul. In one particularly strict region, the act of layering flavors was frowned upon. Boil a leek fine, but add onion and pepper and maybe a touch of wine. Now you're tampering with divine order. That's not a joke. A real 14th century sermon warned against flavored layers of deceitful broth, arguing that man's soul, like his supper, must be transparent. That said, some cooks pushed back with creativity. One monastery in Italy got around the spice ban by accidentally dropping herbs into the pot during prayer. Oops, they'd say, the Lord must want it seasoned. You have to admire the passive-aggressive piety. Tonight we're talking about soup as rebellion, not open rebellion with torches and shouting no. This was a rebellion waged with rosemary, thyme, and bone marrow. Quiet acts of resistance simmering on low heat. It wasn't always about luxury. Sometimes it was about surviving with dignity. For the poor, soup was often the only meal they had. If they could sneak in a little lard or fish bones or anything beyond stale bread and cloudy water, it wasn't gluttony, it was triumph. But telling that to the church wasn't easy. Take the story of Brother Etienne, a monk who brewed a lentil stew so rich it made the abbot suspicious. He was summoned, interrogated, and made to list every ingredient under oath. He said lentils water and God's mercy. When pressed, he added a pinch of nutmeg, but only to honor the Holy Spirit. The abbot was not amused. Etienne was sentenced to a week of raw radishes. This brings us to tonight's odd little nugget. In parts of 13th century Germany, soup clocks were installed in some convent kitchens. They were literal hourglasses designed to limit cooking time so soup couldn't be too refined, too long over fire, and it might tempt someone into satisfaction. Can't have that. And this raises a debate that still bubbles today in academic circles. Was this all about power or fear? Fear that if the lower classes found too much joy in a bowl of stew, they might forget their place. Fear that comfort would breed disobedience. That pleasure, however small, would lead to questions. Why do we fast? Why must we suffer? Why can't soup just be Soup. You ladle yourself a bit of the contraband stew. It's hot, earthy, surprisingly complex. No one strikes you down. The roof doesn't collapse, but you do notice a neighbor quietly slipping in, bowl in hand, eyes hopeful. You offer a spoonful. That's the power the church feared. Connection, sharing, nourishment, not just of body, but of spirit. The kind of thing that makes people a little less afraid, a little more alive. And in the flickering light of that smoky fire, as soup steam rises toward beams older than your grandmother's sarcasm, you realize something strange. Maybe soup isn't just food. Maybe it's a question. And sometimes, asking a question was the most dangerous thing of all. You're elbow deep in carrots when it happens. A voice clear, sharp, and deeply unimpressed rings out across the village square. Sisters, brothers, beware the devil's bouillon. You freeze. A single beat rolls off the table. A goose honks in the distance, seemingly in agreement. The village preacher is back on his soapbox. And today's sermon is aimed directly at soup stock. He's flanked by a small group of highly motivated teenagers holding banners that say things like, "Broth is sloth," and "Holy stew who knew a few children clap." One old man yawns and mutters, "Here we go again." You sigh. Because today, we're exploring the strange world of medieval soup propaganda. Yes, it existed. The church in certain times and places believed that the way you cooked, how long you boiled, what you added, whether you chewed, reflected your moral fiber. And sometimes, entire campaigns were launched to redirect public behavior through kitchen theology. Posters were painted on monastery walls depicting a humble monk sipping clear vegetable broth and rising to heaven, while beside him a plump layman slurps a chunky stew and plummets into flames made entirely of turnips. Subtle. One friar even wrote a didactic poem about the 7 spoons of sin, in which each type of soup spoon, metal wood horn, symbolized a different temptation. By the 4th stanza, the spoon literally talks back. It's not great poetry, but here's the core idea. If you could control the broth, you could control the body. And if you could control the body, maybe just maybe you could control the soul. Which brings us to a fascinating historical detail. There were church-led soup inspections. Yes, real ones. In the 14th century, certain towns held annual broth purity days during Lent, where clergy would visit households, lift lids, and judge contents. These visits were about as welcome as a mouse in your flour sack. One documented case from Flanders describes a deacon scooping out a suspiciously red stew and declaring, "There is too much joy in this pot." That man was hit with a leak on the way out. Now, let's talk loopholes. Because wherever there's soup, there's someone stirring rebellion. Some clever cooks began naming their sins away. A pork stew was renamed Ash Day Gravy. A chicken consommé Pilgrim's Cleanse. And one enterprising chef in Burgundy served a chunky rabbit stew with the claim it was a metaphor for spiritual nourishment. No one was sure what that meant, but they let it slide. Others leaned into absurdity. There's record of a tavern owner who served soup during Lent with a sign that read, "This is not a soup. This is an introspective liquid pilgrimage." He was fined 2 eggs. All of this might sound ridiculous, and it is. But the question lingers, why all this obsession with soup? Here's the academic debate. Was soup truly seen as a threat to virtue, or was it simply too easy to control fire and ingredients are visible? Recipes are oral. Everyone has to eat. Regulating soup meant regulating life itself. And in a world where centralized authority was fragile and literacy rare, food laws were power. But let's not forget the weirdness. In one region of Bavaria, it was believed that soup left uncovered at night could attract demons, specifically small whispering ones that would sing into your lentils and make you crave inappropriate seconds. A popular counterspell was to place a piece of stale bread on the lid and mutter, "Begone broth fiends." This worked exactly 0% of the time, but bread was never wasted. You finish chopping your carrots finely and add them to your own pot, one that's been quietly simmering on the back hearth, slightly out of sight. The aroma is glorious, a hint of thyme, maybe too much garlic, a whisper of something indulgent. The preacher in the square drones on, but fewer people are listening. You hear another door creak open, then another. Neighbors emerge, bowls and hand spoons tucked into sleeves, and you realize this isn't just soup. This is community, smelled across alleyways, shared without measurement, eaten without fear, at least for now. Because for all its fire and brimstone, the church never managed to extinguish the most dangerous ingredient of all, warmth. There's a knock at your door, not the urgent kind, just a soft, sheepish knock. You wipe your hands on your apron, open it, and there stands Jean-Luc, the village's most nervous beekeeper, holding a bowl with both hands, like he's approaching a sacred altar. "May I borrow some soup?" he whispers, eyes darting like he's smuggling poetry. You nod and ladle some into his chipped pottery bowl. He whispers a thank you, tucks it under his cloak, and scuttles off into the mist like a man carrying contraband dreams. Because tonight, we're talking about the secret soup societies of the Middle Ages. Yes, they existed, kind of, in an era when fasting rules grew increasingly tangled vegetables. Yes, eggs, only sometimes. Fish, yes, but only if it doesn't taste too good. Some folks began organizing their own rules, quietly, politely, steamily. These groups didn't have capes or crests, just shared recipes, whispered instructions, and a general agreement that sometimes soup needed to heal rather than humble. The line between spiritual nourishment and culinary rebellion was quite literally simmering. In one French village, a group of widows began meeting weekly in a cellar, making what they called sopa de los silencios, a lentil stew full of forbidden flavor. Not a word was spoken while cooking, not a single syllable. The only sounds, knives tapping ladles, stirring one woman, occasionally humming a suspiciously secular tune. Their motto stitched into the hem of a kitchen towel: "We fast with our hearts, not our spoons." Meanwhile, over in northern Italy, there's record of a midnight minestrone ring. Farmers would gather after dark, make soup, using whatever wasn't approved for Lent, and eat in near total silence. Not out of guilt, just in awe of the fennel. But why the secrecy? Why the hush? Well, there's your historical fact of the day. In some monastic orders, even during fasting periods, monks were required to cook elaborate soups, but for the poor only. They were not permitted to taste what they prepared. Imagine spending hours crafting rich fish stock, adding saffron leeks, chickpeas, all the while your stomach growls in Gregorian chant. It was considered a holy form of restraint, except when monks snuck spoonfuls while checking for salt. Salt checking, by the way, is mentioned 9 times in the margins of one 13th century monastery cookbook. Either their palates were awful, or their self-control was more mythical than practical. Now here's the odd little detail. For the evening, a few soup cauldrons in certain chapels were chained to the wall, not as a punishment, as a warning. They were blessed, then locked, then filled, only under supervision. The idea soup made without spiritual oversight might tempt the flesh, lead the faithful astray, and result in dancing giggling, or even worse, unauthorized seasoning. One record from Burgundy shows a friar being reprimanded for adding rosemary to a Friday broth, his penance cleaning the chapter house with a single goose feather. Feathers, it turns out, are bad mops. Now, some scholars argue this wasn't really about soup at all. Their theory soup was simply the stage on which larger power struggles played out between clergy and layfolk tradition and hunger obedience and the minor rebellion of eating something delicious. They say soup wasn't sinful. It was just visible. Others argue it was even deeper, that soup, unlike bread or wine, changes as it cooks. It's transformation in real time. Add heat and time and care, and you turn scraps into salvation. And maybe that metaphor made the church nervous. After all, if peasants could make something so nourishing from so little, what else might they make? Jean-Luc returns with an empty bowl. He doesn't say much, just nods, and leaves a beeswax candle on your step. You light it. Its glow flickers across the bubbling pot. Outside, the wind howls again. But inside, the secret soup society simmers on one bowl at a time. This morning, the town square smells like onions, not the sweet caramelized kind that signal comfort and home, but the raw, judgmental kind. The kind that says someone's about to cry, and it's probably not because of the slicing. You inch closer, carrying your own modest bowl of barley soup, and see it a public soup tribunal. Yes, a bench, 3 chairs, a suspiciously upright clergyman, and beside him a small barrel labeled evidence. Because today, someone's soup is on trial. Tonight's theme, soup shaming. And oh yes, it was a thing. Let's set the scene. In certain towns during the 14th and 15th centuries, fasting wasn't just a private affair, it was monitored. Soup inspectors, often volunteers with deeply personal grudges, would patrol neighborhoods, sniffing the air, watching chimneys, and if anything smelled too savory, you might find yourself called to explain. The charges: carnal aromas, unholy textures, even immoderate viscosity. You think I'm joking? One record from 1421 details a man fined for serving a stew too joyful in hue. His crime, adding saffron to a pea broth. His punishment, public recitation of a poem titled The Bowl of Regret, which he delivered while holding a spoon carved from humble pine. There were literal soup confessions, and sometimes soup penance. In certain places, if your broth was deemed too luxurious during Lent, you were required to donate a pot of boiled nettle water to the poor, which, let's be honest, probably did more harm than good. But soup shaming wasn't just about flavor, it was class-based too. The poor were expected to eat thin gruels, barely seasoned humble. The wealthy, oh, they could afford loopholes like soups made of crushed almonds and rosewater, technically meatless, but spiritually decadent. There's one fascinating case from Avignon where a noblewoman hosted a soup tasting party on Ash Wednesday. She served 7 broths, all religiously compliant, but in the shape of mythical creatures. The bishop was not amused. Her excuse? Symbolism. His response? Suspension from soup. That phrase became infamous, suspended from soup. No one really knew what it meant. Did she eat stew behind a curtain? Did she have to sip through a reed? We may never know. Let's pause for a moment. Of historical spice, one marginal note in a monastic cookbook reads, Too much cumin inspires restless thoughts. Another warns against soup that sings a phrase used to describe broths so flavorful they make the tongue dance. The tongue dancing. Scandalous. And here's our weird fact of the night. In one German town, soup bowls were standardized in size, handcrafted by monks distributed annually. If your bowl was deemed too wide or too deep, you were suspected of indulgence. People hid their family heirloom soup bowls under floorboards like illegal manuscripts. Now, for the academic spice, some scholars believe soup shaming was a way to reinforce communal identity. By creating a standard of moral broth, authorities could police behavior without direct confrontation. You weren't punished for eating meat. You were scolded for what it meant, a kind of edible guilt. Others say it was more economic. Soup was where scraps turned to substance. If your soup smelled rich, maybe you had too many scraps, and that meant you were hoarding. And that meant you were selfish. And selfishness, in medieval terms, was a spiritual problem. Back in the square, the accused, an old man with a surprisingly luxurious ladle, is asked to describe his soup. Potatoes, leeks, and a little hope. The tribunal mutters. Someone writes hope in Latin on a parchment. He adds, no bones, no bacon, just longing. He is absolved. There is a smattering of applause. You quietly retreat, tucking your own bowl under your cloak. It contains cabbage barley and a very small whisper of something that might once have been a turnip. Safe, but possibly suspicious. You walk home slowly, ears tuned to the breeze, which smells faintly of nutmeg. Suspicious, but not criminal. Not yet. The next day begins with a sneeze. Not yours. Not even human. A goat Henriette sneezes directly into your firewood pile, which might be a blessing depending on how you interpret omens. In the Middle Ages, goats were sometimes considered holy protectors, and sometimes just soup ingredients. And that brings us to tonight's slow-simmered topic, when soup met superstition. You stir a pot absent-mindedly, watching bubbles rise like suspicious thoughts. Because in the world of medieval minds, soup wasn't just nourishment. It was omen ward and warning. Let's talk broths and beliefs. In parts of Eastern Europe, it was said that if your soup refused to boil, even with a strong fire, it meant someone nearby had cursed your kitchen. The solution: add 3 sprigs of thyme and mutter the Lord's Prayer backward, quietly, while looking away from the pot and never blinking. Did it work? Well, the soup eventually boiled, and that was good enough. One manuscript from 1276 mentions soup stars, tiny oil patterns on the surface of broth interpreted like celestial omens. 5 stars meant good fortune. 6 meant gossip. 7, someone in town was pregnant. Don't ask how they made that leap. It's soup. Astrology, not science. Meanwhile, certain herbs, parsley, especially had mystical connotations. In German folklore, parsley was said to only grow in gardens where the woman ruled the house. So, adding parsley to your soup was both seasoning and social commentary. What's that taste? Oh, just mild matriarchy. And here's our historical fact. In some villages, broth wasn't just part of the meal, it was the medicine. Monks kept cauldrons of onion and garlic soup simmering for everything from fevers to melancholy to possession. There's even a record of a priest insisting soup be poured onto the threshold of a house to banish the spirits of rot, which feels more like pest control than theology, but still. Now, on to our delightfully strange detail. A preserved letter from a 14th century widow to her sister includes the line, "I have burned my soup 3 times this week. Either I am cursed or the new ladle is unlucky." She goes on to describe burying the ladle in the garden during a full moon while singing a hymn in minor key. The soup reportedly improved. It's easy to laugh, but let's be honest, don't you? Also have a lucky spoon. Don't we all? Here's where the academics start waving their wooden spoons. Some argue that soup superstitions were simply a way for women, especially older women, to maintain social power in a male-dominated world. If you controlled the hearth and soup was sacred, then you were the quiet center of spiritual balance. Others suggest that because soup often meant what we have, left it became the ideal container for meaning. Every scrap mattered. Every sprinkle of salt could be hope or heresy. In one alpine village, people believed that spilling soup meant impending guests. But spilling while stirring meant the guest would bring bad news. To prevent this, families tied ribbons around their ladles, red for safety, blue for secrets, green for don't let Aunt Margot stay too long. These rituals weren't canon law, but they were canon life. And in one deeply charming case, there was an annual soup fortune day in a Welsh monastery. Monks would each draw an herb from a communal pot, and that herb was stirred into their soup. The cook would then tell their fortune based on what floated to the top first. Basil meant peace. Sage meant sleep. Nettle meant get ready. One monk reportedly drew garlic 3 years in a row and was thereafter known as Brother Breath. Outside, Henriette, the goat stares at your pot with a kind of holy skepticism. You stir anyway, tossing in a bay leaf for safety, because deep down you understand. Soup, for all its warmth and comfort, has always been more than dinner. It's a mirror. And tonight, your reflection smells faintly of rosemary and respect. Tonight you're attending a feast. Well, feast is generous. Let's call it a slightly less terrible dinner. You've been invited by your neighbor, a woman with 6 children, 2 goats, and 1 massive cauldron that seems to be older than the concept of flavor itself. She calls it the family pot. And as she lifts the lid, a smell escapes that is hard to describe. It's not bad, but it's not good either. It's ancient. It's the scent of compromise of centuries-old kitchen negotiations. It's what happens when soup becomes an heirloom. Which brings us to tonight's spoonful of historical intrigue perpetual soup, or, as it was known in some parts of Europe, eternal broth. Yes, eternal. Imagine a soup that never ends. One pot, always simmering, day and night. You never dump it out. You just keep adding to it. New vegetables, leftover bones, cabbage from yesterday, herbs from tomorrow. It's a culinary Ouroboros. In some households, these pots would be kept going for weeks, even months. In one French village, there's a half-documented rumor of a stew that lasted for nearly 3 centuries, supposedly passed down generation to generation, with each new caretaker adding their touch and their family secrets. You look at your neighbor's pot. It might not be that old, but you suspect it has outlived at least one king. There's something both unsettling and comforting about the idea. A broth that's always there, changing slightly, but never disappearing. It's basically the Middle Ages answer to therapy. Need a hug? Have some soup. Need to confess a sin? Stir the pot. Need to hide a questionable turnip? Toss it in and pretend it's seasoning. Now, here's your academic fact of the night pot au feu. The French version of this concept dates back to at least the 14th century. Families would maintain the pot as the hearth's heartbeat, always warm, always waiting. Leftovers weren't waste, they were foundation. And there were rules. You had to feed the fire carefully. You couldn't let the pot boil too hard or too softly. And heaven forbid you let it go cold. A cold pot was a curse, a break in lineage. In some places, you had to relight it with a fire from a neighbor's house as if borrowing their luck. This brings us to a delightfully weird detail. In a Bavarian village, it was said that if a perpetual soup boiled dry, a spirit named Suppengeist would appear at your door. Suppengeist, translated loosely, is soup ghost. He was believed to knock twice, once to warn you, and once to remind you to add water. Ignore the second knock, and your cabbages would sour for a year. A chilling fate. But perhaps the most poetic part of the eternal pot wasn't fear, it was memory. People said they could taste the past in the broth, a hint of their mother's rosemary, the smoky turnip from the year of the great frost, the meaty richness from the summer cousin Thomas accidentally dropped a sausage in during a funeral. Soup became archive, memory, resistance against forgetting. And this wasn't just culinary nostalgia, it was economic resilience. When meat was scarce, flavor had to come from somewhere. And where better than the ghosts of dinners past? Here's your strange but true fact. In one medieval inn, a forever pot was advertised with the line, "Today's soup contains the kindness of 3 Mondays ago." That sounds sweet, until you realize how little refrigeration they had. Now, let's stir in a bit of controversy. Historians disagree on whether the perpetual soup was a real daily practice or more symbolic. Some say the idea of an unending stew was more aspirational than literal, a metaphor for communal life. Others argue, if you've ever been broke, tired, and hungry, you know exactly how a perpetual soup works. One pot, one flame, one slow, stubborn form of survival. Another fun fringe theory. Some anthropologists propose that the perpetual pot acted as a subtle resistance to church control. While fast days were enforced and luxury was frowned upon, a family could sneak richer flavors into their endless broth without attracting suspicion. A little meat here, a splash of wine there. Who's to say where it came from? It's always been there. Your neighbor ladles you a bowl. You notice flecks of green parsley maybe. Something starchy could be parsnip or potato or something that began as one and evolved into the other. There's definitely a lentil and something chewy that you don't ask about. You taste it, and it's oddly good. Not in the way of fine dining, but in the way of belonging. It tastes like tired feet and borrowed firewood and 5 stories that begin with "during the plague." You look up and see the neighbor watching you. She says, "It's better if you don't stir the bottom." You nod solemnly, because of course it is. The bottom of an eternal soup is where decisions go to rest, where root vegetables and regrets sit together softened by time. As the meal continues, you learn that one of the children has named the pot. They call it Big Agnes. Big Agnes once swallowed. A spoon was mistaken for a cauldron of dye during Lent, and one time allegedly saved a man from heartbreak. He cried into her broth for 3 days straight. She turned his tears into seasoning. It was by all accounts her finest work. You begin to understand why the church may not have liked this. The eternal pot bypasses hierarchy. It ignores purity laws. It's comfort without permission. When soup never ends, you stop waiting for permission to start again. Even the act of tending to it becomes radical, a bubbling defiance, a reminder that the sacred doesn't always wear robes. It sometimes wears steam and smells faintly of leek. So tonight you sip slowly, carefully, as if honoring the taste of 1,000 dinners before. You may never know what's in it exactly, but somehow it tastes like survival. And parsley. Always parsley. Tonight you're on kitchen duty. Don't panic. There's no recipe involved. There's no glass, measuring cup, no timer beeping at you, and no fridge filled with confusing, half-open condiments that may or may not have been from the Crusades. No, your task tonight is simpler. You're in charge of soup in a monastery, and not just any soup. You're about to make monastic soup, the humble holy brew that nourished the cloistered stomachs of monks and nuns across medieval Europe. It's quiet here. Your footsteps echo down the stone corridor. Outside, the garden rustles with the gentle breath of mint leeks and too much cabbage. Inside, a wooden spoon rests beside a pot so large it could fit a small horse, or at least a moderately judgmental friar. And here's the historical heart of it: monastic soup wasn't just about food. It was a ritual, a theology, a daily act of both submission and resistance. In theory, monks were supposed to eat simply to reflect humility, detachment, and obedience. But in practice, that line got steamy fast. Let's start with the canonical rules. Monks weren't allowed to eat meat from four-legged animals. Fish, sure. Birds, sometimes. But no beef stew, no pork, sausage, no midnight goat burgers. So what did they do? They got creative. Imagine a soup with leeks, barley onions, garlic, maybe some chickpeas if your abbey had good connections. Add dried herbs, wild mushrooms, even almond milk during fast days. And of course, bread. Always bread. Sometimes dunked, sometimes thickened into the soup until it resembled beige lava. Now for your historical fun fact of the night, the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed by many monastic orders for centuries, specifically instructed monks to eat 2 cooked dishes per meal to avoid the sin of gluttony through variety. The idea was that less variety meant more holiness. Naturally, this led to the invention of very complicated soups, because when you only get one pot, you learn to make it count. Here's where it gets sneakily brilliant. Some monastic kitchens began stuffing their soup with as much as they legally could. Spices from afar, fennel, chestnuts, a bit of grated cheese when the abbot wasn't looking. They'd argue, "Oh, it's still just one dish." Meanwhile, the church higher-ups frowned. There were official letters, episcopal admonitions that chastised abbeys for treating their soup pots like carnival booths. One archbishop in 1219 complained that some monks make broth so thick and rich that the devil himself might mistake it for feast. You glance nervously into your own pot. It's bubbling gently, sending up hints of rosemary and garlic. You may have also added a small splash of wine, which technically violates the fast, but also technically doesn't count if no one sees. Speaking of rules, did you know that certain monasteries had soup schedules? Monday might be lentil day, Wednesday root vegetables, Friday peas and more peas. One particularly strict Cistercian abbey banned onions for being too exciting. Imagine being banned for flavor. But here's the weird twist of tonight's tale. While monks were perfecting their soup game, soup itself was becoming politically dangerous. Sea soup, especially monastic soup, became associated with knowledge. Monasteries preserved ancient texts, developed agriculture, experimented with herbs and brewing. Some scholars argue that the soup pot became a symbol of control. The abbey decided what went into the pot, who got to eat, How much? When? A priest once joked that the fastest way to rebellion wasn't through swords, it was through the soup line. So the church, in its wider structure, began keeping a very curious eye on kitchens. Inquisitors, not just of faith, but of flavor. And the nuns. Oh, they were soup legends. One 13th century nun in Flanders, Sister Beatrice, was known for her miraculous carrot soup. It was said to heal sadness, mend joints, and once saved a bishop from heartbreak. She refused to share the recipe. She said it came from prayer. Modern historians suspect it was heavy on nutmeg and possibly gin. In some convents, soup became a subtle act of community care and defiance. Sisters would add extra ingredients to help the poor, stretching the pot further than doctrine allowed. They called it mercy broth, but not everyone appreciated their generosity. One bishop in 1314 accused a group of nuns of simmering secrets. He claimed their soup was too thick, too joyful, and improperly seasoned for piety. They responded by smiling sweetly and doubling the pepper. Soup, it turns out, could be a feminist act. Let's not forget the politics of portion. In wealthier monasteries, visiting clergy often got richer servings, more beans, more butter, the good barley. This caused tension. One poor friar recorded bitterly in his diary, "They preach of humility and then dine like dukes." Of course, the diary was written in soup stains, which frankly is the most monk-like way to complain. And then there's the debate. Was soup sacred or subversive? Some historians believe that by quietly modifying their soup, monks and nuns were asserting tiny freedoms, culinary loopholes in an otherwise rigid life. Others argue that soup simply became too important to fail. If your entire day revolves around 2 meals and chanting for 6 hours, you learn to love your lentils. And now, for your bizarre footnote of the night. In 1293, an abbey in northern Italy recorded an incident titled "The Great Soup Scalding." Apparently, a novice attempted to add saffron to the pot, slipped, and overturned the entire cauldron. The resulting steam set off the chapel fire alarm, a bell with a very confused monk. 3 hours of liturgical chaos ensued. The novice was forgiven. The soup was not. And yet, all these centuries later, monastic soup still echoes. You sip your humble bowl and wonder, how did a simple pot of barley and broth carry so much weight? Maybe it's because soup was the one part of the day no one could fake. You could mumble your psalms. You could nap during vespers. But soup required effort. Wood had to be chopped, water fetched, ingredients cleaned and stirred with patience. Soup was honest work. And in its own quiet way, it was resistance. Not in the fiery, sword-waving sense, but in the slow, steady, boiling on purpose kind of way. You add one last sprig of thyme, lower the heat, and let it simmer in silence. The chapel bells ring. Somewhere down the hall, footsteps gather. Another meal is coming. Another round of sacred soup. You'll serve it with care. Because in a world of silence, repetition, and rigid rules, this pot might be your loudest prayer. Tonight, you're out of the kitchen and into the field. But don't get too excited. It's not a vacation. It's cabbage duty. And you're about to discover why soup in the Middle Ages often began long before it reached the pot. Because soup wasn't just something you made, it was something you grew. Picture this. It's early morning dew still clinging to the grass, and you're trudging across the garden of a small rural monastery. Behind you, a donkey stares judgmentally. In front of you, a plot of earth that's equal parts mud roots and theological frustration. You've been assigned to the hortus, the kitchen garden. And like every medieval gardener worth their salt, and it's very expensive salt, you know that every cabbage leek and wild sorrel you plant will eventually go into the soup. But here's your first surprising fact of the night. In many abbeys, gardens were considered sacred, not just as a metaphor for Eden, but as a living pharmacy. Plants weren't just for food, they were for healing fasting and surviving winter with only turnips for company. You lean down and pull a weed, wondering if it's secretly the cure for gout. It's not. It's just a very aggressive dandelion. Cabbages dominate this garden. Huge, leafy, slightly aggressive looking. Medieval people loved cabbage. Raw, boiled, pickled, fermented. One abbot wrote an entire sermon comparing cabbage to the humility of Christ. Spoiler, it did not go viral. But cabbage soup wasn't just economical, it was spiritual. During Lent, when meat and dairy were forbidden, soup became a lifeline, and cabbage was a champion. High in fiber, low in scandal, easy to grow, impossible to ignore. That's why most soup recipes from medieval manuscripts include a phrase like, "Take cabbage as much as God provides." And that's not just poetic, it was literal. Medieval weather was brutal. Crop yields were unpredictable. Some years you had enough to feed a bishop's banquet. Other years, your soup was 3 sad leaves and a prayer. That's why monasteries became early leaders in agricultural science. You might not expect it, but behind those silent walls, monks were experimenting. They tracked frost dates, measured soil, observed moon cycles, wrote treatises on how to grow carrots in cursed dirt. One 12th century monk, Brother Godwin, invented a cabbage strain so hardy it survived hailstorms and foot traffic. He named it St. Helena's Shield. Sadly, it tasted like despair. Still, he wrote about it in Latin because even failed cabbage deserved academic respect. As you dig in the soil, you begin to appreciate the process behind soup. The toil, the blisters, the way vegetables were never taken for granted. Let's pause here for your curious twist of the night. In 1312, a monastery in southern France began experimenting with silent soup gardening. It was part of a vow of extreme quiet, where monks farmed without speaking, using hand signals for more compost and "please stop throwing turnips at me." The records show it worked, until a novice accidentally mimed crucifixion when he meant "I found a mole." After that, the hand signals were revised. Back to the garden, you notice a patch of wild herbs, parsley, sage thyme, and wait, no rosemary. Someone always forgets rosemary. These herbs weren't just for flavor. They were believed to carry moral properties. Parsley for clarity, sage for wisdom, thyme for courage. Adding them to soup was in a way like adding prayers or very leafy intentions. And here's your academic debate for the evening. Did soup evolve as a survival food or a symbolic ritual? Some historians argue it was all about calories, liquid meals that could stretch scarce ingredients. Others claim soup became a daily liturgy, a quiet performance of spiritual submission. And still others say it was both, because nothing says balanced monasticism like contemplating mortality while chopping celery. Let's not forget what happened to soup when crops failed. During famine years, monks turned to empty pot broth, literally water maybe flavored with wild garlic or the memory of a carrot. And yet they still gathered, still prayed, still ate together. There's something moving about that. You're covered in dirt now, and your knees ache, but you feel it, the quiet power of feeding people, the sacredness of planting something you may never eat, of making soup, not just for yourself, but for the ones who will come after. You pause to look up. The sun's rising higher. Somewhere behind the cloister walls, a bell rings. Soup prep is beginning. You'll be late, but you've done your part. Your hands may be raw, your feet muddy, but your garden grows. And in this small act, muddy, simple, repetitive, you've continued a chain that stretches back centuries. Not bad for a humble cabbage. And now, 3 light-hearted observations before we simmer down for the night. You now understand why monks had strong opinions about soil. When your soup depends on a carrot surviving hail, you learn to respect the beetroot. Medieval gardening tools were mostly sticks and hope. If you wanted a rake, you asked the carpenter. If you wanted it quickly, you prayed. Cabbages don't scream when you pick them, but they do judge you with every leaf. You rise, stretch your aching back, and begin the walk back to the kitchen. Tonight's soup will taste slightly of thyme, humility, and compost, but it will be warm and shared, and like all the best things in history, quietly, gently defiant. The pot will boil, the spoons will clink, and you'll remember that in a world where not much was certain soup was, tonight the kitchen smells like secrets. You've returned from the cabbage garden, your hands still smudged with dirt, only to find the soup already simmering low and slow, like a confession whispered through steam. But something's different, something richer, darker, mysterious. You lean over the pot. It's mushroom, but not just any mushroom. The kind that made kitchen stories more mysterious than the ingredients list. The kind the church never quite knew what to do with. Because tonight, we enter the murky, delicious, slightly peculiar world of medieval mushroom soup. Let's get this out of the way. Mushrooms made people nervous. Not all mushrooms, just the interesting ones. The big, meaty Boletus acceptable. The tiny red ones with white specks. Well, if you saw those in your bowl, you were either about to meet a higher power or definitely someone pretending to be one. Medieval understanding of fungi was like trying to learn algebra by staring at your shoe. They grew in the dark, fed on rot, and popped up overnight like gossip. So naturally, many believed mushrooms were suspicious, or worse, magical. Which leads us to tonight's first historical fact. Some monasteries banned mushrooms from their kitchens altogether. Too earthy, too unpredictable, too tangled with tales of witches, forest spirits, and dreams that walked sideways. But that didn't stop people from using them, especially when meat was scarce, or the Lent rules were extra strict, or when a certain monk had a fondness for forest walks and a tendency to color outside the lines. Let's talk about that monk. His name was Brother Remy. He lived in a Benedictine abbey, nestled against a forest, thick with moss mist and mushrooms. And while the rest of the kitchen staff boiled onions into oblivion, Remy wandered into the woods with a basket and a grin. He knew every mushroom by name, feel, and smell. He claimed the saints guided his hands, though others suspected it was sheer stubbornness and the occasional lucky guess. Remy invented what he called the sevenfold soup. 7 types of mushrooms, 7 herbs, 7 slow turns of the ladle. He wrote the recipe in the margins of a psalter with a note for lean times and soulful flavor. But here's where it gets awkward. One evening, after serving the soup to a visiting bishop, the entire refectory reportedly became very emotional during Vespers. Some claimed they saw angels. Others just really missed their mother's cabbage pie. The bishop, He banned mushrooms from the region for 20 years, which brings us to our curious detail of the night. Mushrooms were sometimes added to soup in secret under names like forest meat or earth truffles. Some medieval cookbooks even warned, if thou must stir such ingredients into the pot, do it in silence and serve it only to those who ask no questions. You wonder what's in tonight's soup. The cook won't say. She just nods to the cauldron and mumbles forest's kindness. You ladle yourself a bowl. The flavor is deep, nutty complex, like roasted walnuts and damp leaves and something old. Not bad old, just wise. And that's the thing about medieval soup. It held memories, layers, things you didn't always recognize but trusted anyway. Let's stir in our academic debate, shall we? Were mushrooms used in sacred or symbolic ways? Some scholars argue that fungi, especially the rare and strong-smelling ones, played roles in folk rituals and fringe spiritual practices. Others say the church worked hard to sever any connection between fungi and spiritual insight, branding them as distractions or temptations of the imagination, because the idea of seeing God outside of liturgy made people uneasy. A soup that opened your mind. That's a theological pickle. You take another bite. This one's chewy, possibly a chanterelle, or a very soft snail. Let's pretend it's a chanterelle. Now here's the oddest part. There were secret soup books. In a few rare archives, tucked away in theological libraries, are hand-bound recipe collections from traveling friars and village healers. Recipes that blend kitchen herbs with forest mushrooms and hopeful intentions. One faded recipe reads, "Boil slow in moonlight. Do not look away." Another, "For remembering lost names, take the red cap, but only a pinch." These weren't just soups, they were stories, whispers, possibly creative daydreams, but certainly sincere. You picture Brother Remy again, alone by the hearth, stirring his strange brew, whispering thanks to the forest and ignoring doctrine. Not all monks wore mushrooms on their sleeves, but someone had to. Let's lighten the pot with a few tender laughs. Trying to identify mushrooms in the 1300s was like playing edible or eternal nap. Every forest walk was a gamble, and yet they walked. If you ate a bad mushroom in the Middle Ages, your options were pray nap and drink onion broth until further notice, or confess every sin you'd ever considered just in case. No one in medieval Europe ever said, "Trust me, I'm a mushroom expert." But they did say, "If I don't come back, tell Brother Pierre he can have my soup spoon." You finish your bowl slowly, watching the last drops catch firelight. Outside, the wind rustles through trees. You imagine small caps pushing through wet soil. Patient, persistent. There's something profound about that. Mushrooms remind us that even in decay, there's flavor. Even in darkness, there's growth. And even when something is misunderstood, it might still feed you body and soul. You smile, your belly warm, and whisper a small thank you to Brother Remy wherever he is. He probably still walks through misty woods in your dreams, offering you soup with a wink and a warning. Not too much. Unless you're ready to dream in colors your palate has never met. Good night, forest meat. Good night, secret soup. Tonight the soup is not in a bowl. It's in a stone basin. Cool, quiet, reflective. You stare at it with the same expression you'd give a priest who just said, "This stew is meant to teach you patience." Because this isn't just a meal, it's a lesson. One gentle spoonful at a time. Welcome to monastic fasting soup. Known in some historical texts as jus clarum and in whispered kitchen humor as abbot's broth or Lenten discipline. Before you drift off to sleep, let's explore how a simple pot of soup once stood at the crossroads of flavor, faith, and philosophy. It wasn't soup that raised questions, nor onions, nor vegetables, but the warmth itself, the comfort, the way seasoning could turn sustenance into satisfaction. And in some monastic traditions, from the 11th to 13th centuries, that sensation was approached with caution. The idea food should nourish the body, not distract the soul. Which brings us to our first historical flavor note. Some monastic kitchens diluted soup until it became intentionally simple. Records from Cistercian communities describe broth being boiled, skimmed and thinned with water, served alongside bread and reflection. A phrase written in one manuscript reads, "Let thy hunger serve thy humility, not thy delight." You try a spoonful. It tastes thoughtful, no salt. Salt was often set aside during fasting seasons. No meat, no butter. On stricter days, not even legumes. Just boiled greens grains and the memory of a turnip. And now, for tonight's curious culinary footnote. There are stories of kitchen caretakers gently nudged for overseasoning. One 14th century nun reportedly added an extra leek from the garden. Her supervisor gently reminded her even abundance must be quiet. She was reassigned perhaps to bread, perhaps to balance. Still, not all communities held identical standards, and where soup simmered, flavor found its way. Let's visit the warm undercurrent of kitchen creativity. In many monasteries, stories spread of little additions, a dash of garlic, a sprinkle of herb, a crust of aged cheese saved from feast days. One friar even floated a tiny egg in barley stew, calling it a devotion to Saint Benedict. It was later known as confession soup. In a convent in Provence soup, one Lent was so delicious that a gentle inquiry followed. It turned out someone had added saffron not out of rebellion, but perhaps to lift spirits. The moment became legend. Now, for the thoughtful scholar's spoonful, were these simple soups acts of discipline or reflections of a greater balance? Some say these recipes reflected commitment, a path to focus gratitude and harmony. Others suggest they marked roles and boundaries. Some tasted more, others less. A third thought is that caution around flavor was part of a deeper cultural rhythm. That restraint, even in taste, was seen as a step toward spiritual peace, but the heart of it may lie elsewhere. In a small margin note of one old kitchen ledger, someone once scribbled, "When none look add time, for the earth gave flavor, and gratitude is quiet." You imagine the monk or nun behind that line, alone in the kitchen, a sprig of thyme pinched between their fingers, a pause, a smile, not to defy the rules, but to remember. Remember gardens, home, grandparents who stirred soup with stories, the warmth that fed not just the body, but memory itself. So tonight, as your bowl cools, you reflect not on what's missing, but on what remains, the warmth, the care, the comfort that even a humble soup can bring. Because maybe in every age, we need reminders that nourishment doesn't always mean richness, and that simplicity, too, can be sacred. You exhale into the evening air. Somewhere in a quiet kitchen, a spoon stirs again. A prayer is whispered, a pinch of joy added. And yes, brother, we noticed the clove, and we thank you. Tonight, the soup is forbidden, not because it's poisoned, not because it's cursed, but because it's Wednesday, and you're a peasant in the 14th century, and the church has declared this particular soup to be too joyful for midweek consumption. You're not making this up. Well, technically you are, but only because they made it up first. Welcome to the curious world of soup prohibitions and feast day loopholes, a swirling broth of theology, superstition, and seasonal regulations, so complex it makes modern tax code look like a grocery list. Let's start with a historical fact, so specific it feels like satire. In some medieval dioceses, soup made with eggs was banned on Wednesdays, Fridays, and during the entire 40 days of Lent, unless you were over 70 traveling nursing a child or had a bishop's permission in writing. No yoke, pun intended. And here you are not old, not traveling, and definitely not holding an infant. But your grandmother, she's simmering a glorious pot of egg-thickened onion broth, smug as a cat on a feast day. Why? Because she knows the loopholes, and she knows how to whisper the phrase for strength and virtue just loud enough that the parish clerk nods and looks away. The church's relationship with soup wasn't just about flavor. It was about control symbolism and ritual purity. On feast days, the broth could sing. Thickened with almonds, scented with rosewater, golden with saffron. A bowl of pious luxury. On fast days, you got clear liquid, preferably gray. Ideally, dispiriting. And if you dared stir in a yolk or a bone or a trace of butter that wasn't seasoning, that was rebellion. Now for a strange but true aside, there were arguments serious. Theological arguments about whether pureed soup counted as chewing. Yes, chewing. In certain interpretations of fasting rules, solid food was banned. But liquids were okay. So what about soup? Is it liquid? Is it food? If you drink a spoonful of lentil puree, but don't move your jaw, is that a sin? One 13th century priest said yes. Another said no. A third proposed that the answer depended on whether you licked it slowly or swallowed it fast. Honestly, you can't make this stuff up, except they did. So what did people do? They adapted. Subtly, cleverly. They made shadow soups, bland stews that appeared penitential, but were quietly decadent. One favorite was blessed peas water, made by boiling split peas and removing them before serving the broth, then secretly spooning the peas back in after sunset. Another saint's broth, a beet-based soup with fermented rye bread hidden under the bowl for spiritual anchoring. There's even a documented recipe for Ash Wednesday Surprise, which was literally cabbage soup served with a spoon dipped in bacon fat but never stirred. Just dipped. The church frowned, but couldn't prove anything. Now comes our academic controversy of the evening. Was all this liturgical soup law actually about health, or was it a theatrical performance of moral discipline? Historians love to debate this. Some argue that fasting was genuinely intended to promote physical and spiritual well-being, that abstaining from rich soup helped balance the humors, cleanse the soul, and teach empathy. Others say it was about power. If the church could tell you when and how to boil carrots, it could tell you anything. Soup was just the stage on which obedience was tested, bite by diluted bite. And still others propose a third view that it was about memory, about marking time, about shaping the rhythm of weeks and seasons with texture and taste. Feast days were velvety. Fast days were thin. Together, they made a calendar your tongue could feel. And that brings us to the best part of tonight's story, the secret stubborn creativity of people who just wanted soup, that didn't taste like remorse. Let's visit a peasant village in Normandy. You're there now, hungry, tired, and very much aware that it's Friday. The priest has preached about abstinence. The mayor has reinforced the soup patrol. You are not to enjoy anything that sloshes. And yet, behind one cottage, something simmers. Thick, golden, fragrant. You approach. A woman ladles a spoonful, looks around, and whispers, "It's barley water." She winks. It's not barley water. It's fishbone stock, slow cooked with onion peel, a smuggled nutmeg shaving, and a dash of vinegar. Is it legal? Probably not. Is it holy? Who can say? Is it delicious? Your eyes say yes. You drink. And you feel briefly, not like a sinner, but like a person. Warm, fed, alive. So here are your 3 sleepy chuckles for the night. A 15th century village priest once accused his congregation of licking soup with lust. He was later reassigned to counting candles. One monastery wrote a formal list of banned soup ingredients. At the bottom was the note, "Also no joy." In a town in southern France, soup made with duck fat was declared an instrument of spiritual distraction. It was then renamed miracle broth and served in secret for 20 years. Now you lie back, smile faintly, and wonder what you'd cook if no one was watching. Would you use the yolk, the garlic, the smuggled cheese? Probably, because soup isn't just food. It's memory, it's defiance, it's love in liquid form. The church may have tried to legislate every spoonful, but the people, they always found a way to sneak flavor back in. One sip at a time, and you sleep better, knowing that somewhere deep in time, someone once risked a week of confession just to make sure the broth tasted right. You wake up in a thatched cottage, and you're already in trouble. There's a pot on the fire that shouldn't be there. A smell in the air that shouldn't exist. A feeling warm, savory, defiant, that lingers in the steam curling toward the rafters. Today's trouble is about who is allowed to make soup, and more dangerously, who is not. Because tonight, we're plunging our wooden spoon into a bubbling pot of gendered broth and forbidden ladles, the centuries-old suspicion that women making soup might also be brewing something else. No, not poison. Well, sometimes poison, but usually something far more terrifying to the authorities, knowledge independence, and a recipe they didn't approve of. Let's begin with your grandmother. She's got herbs in her apron and a look in her eye like she knows secrets the bishop would rather remain forgotten. She knows that if she dries sage upside down, it keeps better through winter. That nettles, boiled with vinegar, can draw out a fever. And that leek simmered in goat milk settle the stomach of a child who's seen too much war. She also knows how to keep this knowledge just outside the line of suspicion, because in many parts of medieval Europe, if you were a woman and you knew too much about soup, especially healing soups, you were one sneeze away from being labeled a cunning woman. Or, worse, a witch. Here's your strange but true historical detail. In several 14th century inquisitorial records, soup making was used as evidence of heresy or witchcraft, specifically if your soup cured someone unexpectedly, or if it included herbs that didn't grow locally, or if you made it on a Thursday during Lent and called it strengthening broth. One woman in Toulouse was accused of heresy soup because her pot smelled too pleasant for a penitent widow. Another was questioned for broth of unnatural warmth. Unnatural warmth, Imagine your kitchen skills being so good they were considered a threat to the moral order. So yes, the church loved soup, but only when they made it, they approved it, and they could track its ingredients. Women, especially poor women, their soup was a risk because soup wasn't just dinner. It was a tool of autonomy, a quiet, bubbling form of care and power. If you knew how to feed people when they were sick, when the roads were closed, when the priest was gone, when the doctor cost a goat, you held power. Not flashy power, not sword power, but soft power. The power of keeping others alive. And nothing is more terrifying to a rigid hierarchy than someone they can't control keeping others alive. Let's talk about a specific historical case. In 1324, in Kilkenny, Ireland, a woman named Alice Kittler was accused of witchcraft heresy, and you guessed it, suspicious culinary practices. Among the items listed in the indictment were powders and potions used in stews oils infused with serpent's blood, and a small wooden spoon that was said to stir without hand. Let's set aside the serpent part for now. The point is, food was evidence, and soup was a ritual. So where does this fear come from? Some scholars argue that it wasn't about soup at all. It was about information. Remember, recipes weren't written down for most people. They were taught passed from one person to another, usually from older women to younger ones. When a woman knew how to make a soup that soothed a cough or eased childbirth, she wasn't just cooking. She was preserving knowledge that the church couldn't supervise. That scared people. And when fear and hierarchy mix, you get firewood. Of course, this doesn't mean every woman with a pot was in danger. Plenty cooked with care, love, and complete obscurity. But some pushed the broth just far enough. There's a documented case of a peasant woman in rural Bohemia who ran what we'd now call a soup kitchen. Every Thursday, she'd make an enormous pot of root vegetable stew and serve anyone who came, travelers, widows, orphans, even excommunicated beggars. She said it was for God. The local priest said it was against God because she did it without permission, because she didn't ask the church who was worthy of soup, because in a world of scarcity, she made plenty. Eventually, she was warned, then fined, then her pot was taken. But the people remembered, and a generation later, her recipe lived on. Passed down, renamed, respiced. Quietly, stealthily, lovingly. So here's tonight's academic controversy. Were women accused of witchcraft because of their healing broths or because of the communities they nourished with them? Some historians argue the soup was just a convenient excuse, that the real fear was independence. That when women fed outsiders, healed enemies, or simply refused to follow fast day rules, they were challenging the social order. Others suggest that some healing soups were genuinely viewed as supernatural because they worked better than the official medicine of the time. Still others say that soup was never the issue. It was just what happened to be in the pot when the men showed up with torches. Regardless of the interpretation, one thing's clear: soup could get you in trouble if you were the wrong person helping the wrong person at the wrong time. And now, your moment of quiet rebellion. It's midnight in the village. The hearth is low, and a girl barely 12 is sneaking into her grandmother's cottage. She's been coughing for days. The priest says it's penance. The healer says it's fate. But the old woman, she puts on a kettle. She crushes time with the heel of her hand. She adds onion, barley, garlic, and a pinch of salt that was hidden behind a loose brick. The pot begins to bubble. The girl begins to breathe easier. Is it magic? Is it medicine? Or is it just soup? You decide. And now your three gentle chuckles to end the evening. A 14th century herbalist in Florence was arrested for preparing soup that revived a goat assumed dead. In one trial, a woman was accused of summoning spirits with dumplings. She was later found not guilty because the bishop liked her broth. A medieval cookbook includes this note: to make soup for a weary man, take herbs of compassion and stir clockwise lest it shame the angels. You lie back now. Let your breath slow. You think of all the women named and nameless who stirred pots in silence, who risked accusation for the sake of comfort, who whispered healing into root vegetables and poured warmth into chipped bowls. And you remember that not all power comes from pulpits. Sometimes it comes from a spoon. Sometimes it smells like garlic and thyme and quietly says, "You are not alone." Sometimes it saves you. You wake up to the soft sounds of early morning wood, creaking gently above the breeze, whispering through the shutters, and something bubbling in the hearth. Odd. You didn't start any fire today, but someone did. There's a pot simmering in the corner, steam curling upward with a scent both familiar and brave garlic leek, and something warmer still. A wooden spoon leans against the rim like it's been waiting. It's your soup, but not made by you, because you're no longer the only one. You remember how it started. A cough soothed with bone broth and yarrow, frostbitten hands warmed by beet and vinegar soup. A tired child walking again after 3 days of lentils and marrow. Word spread, not in protest, but in hope. Now a dozen homes stir their own pots. Unofficial, unapproved, unstoppable. Today is your last morning before visitors arrive, official ones. They'll ask about food practices, about community traditions, about things that aren't written down but live quietly in kitchens. Let's pause for a real story. In 1432, a small convent in Avignon was questioned for offering soups to the poor without formal guidance. The soups were healing too. Healing, some said. One account says a visitor arrived with scrolls of rules, tasted the stew, and walked away without a word. The soup said enough. Back in your village, you step outside. The sky is still dim, but smoke rises gently from other chimneys. Lights flicker. Pots bubble. Something has shifted. This isn't protest. It's presence. Shared nourishment. A quiet liturgy of kindness. Soon, the council will arrive. There will be announcements, guidelines, lists. But before that, your village gathers. Each household brings out a pot. No banners, no speeches, just soup, barley and turnip, onion and bean, cabbage and warmth, labeled gently for comfort, for the tired, for healing, for those forgotten, for those who believe and care, not just rules. A child stirs the pot marked "for forgiveness" with a spoon too large for her hands. When the officials arrive, they stop. They see the table, the bowls, the people. Someone asks, "Who organized this?" You raise your hand. Then someone else, and then another, until everyone in the square is pointing at themselves. What happens next? Some say such gatherings were discouraged. Others say nothing happened at all. Perhaps because the food was good, or the moment was needed. Either way, something changed. Not with noise, not with arguments, but with warmth. And here's your final question. Was this resistance or just care? Some believe it was quiet bravery a shared belief in helping each other without waiting for permission. Others say it was just what people do when winter is hard and kindness matters most. Maybe it was both. Maybe every pot held a little salt, a little root, and a whole lot of hope. Now, your final 3 spoonfuls of history's gentle humor. A monk once paused pea soup in his monastery because it made the novices laugh too freely. One French village renamed their Sunday stew Pilgrim Water to politely confuse the visiting bishop. A medieval joke went, "What does the cook say before dinner? Bless this pot, may it not boil over." You smile. You didn't challenge the world. You just cared for it. The fire softens. The ladles rest. A baby sighs. A bowl is scraped clean. And you sleep. Not because the work is done, but because now it's shared. So now the broth has settled. The last spoon has been laid down. The fire is just embers. You've done enough. You've stirred the pot, not for power, not for praise, but for warmth, for care, for memory. Maybe you didn't save the world, but you made dinner. You made enough. And that's how most revolutions start, isn't it? Not with banners or horns, but with a quiet hand chopping onions by candlelight, with someone choosing to share their last potato, with a whisper of sage across a bowl passed around a circle of tired, laughing souls. You don't need a cathedral to feel something sacred. Sometimes a chipped wooden bowl filled with something hot and simple is enough to remind you you belong here. Let this moment stay with you now. Let it soften the corners of your day. Let the quiet settle into your shoulders. Let your breath slow down like soup cooling on a windowsill. You've made it through another evening. And somewhere in the distance, across centuries and oceans, another pot is bubbling. Another story is being told with turnips. Another person is finding peace in the most ancient ritual of all, feeding one another. You are part of that. You always were. So close your eyes now. The soup is warm, the night is kind, and the world is quieter than it was. That's the story. For tonight, may your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.